And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room already tonight. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, we're having a heat wave.
Yes, we are.
In September, no less. But that's been kind of interesting. And I guess the weather in general has been on the bizarre side. And we know there's a lot of weather tampering going on. And so nothing is ever quite as it should be, as we know. But tonight we're going into something, speaking of things that aren't as they should be, which is a very special episode that has a lot to do with the themes that we brought here in a breakthrough last week. And that is DRAM, the JFK assassination, aerospace, Antarctica, and UFO file. And DRAM, as it turns out, is a very interesting character. And this is Werner von Elvenschleben, who was a Nazi assassin who was turned by the OSS and then eventually hooked up with the CIA. And just before the Kennedy assassination, found himself the guest of D.H. Byrd, the owner of the Texas School Book Depository, oil man, aerospace entrepreneur, and LBJ acolyte, and certainly incredible LBJ funder and supporter over the years. And it just so happens D.H. Byrd is also the person who started the Civil Air Patrol, out of which Lee Harvey Oswald, when he went to work in that building, a lot of things were going on immediately for the owners. So this is really kind of an unusual situation that we find ourselves in that there's a court case pending, which is to get more information out of the CIA about the activities of Elvenschleben, DRAM, as it were. This is a big breakthrough in the case, and we're going to get into it tonight and show the direct links between the assassination, aerospace, the UFO file, and Antarctica. They are all heavily, heavily implicated in this research. And we're going to go deep with you on that tonight as well. Of course, in the second part of tonight's program, we're going to be taking your questions, and you can ask those anytime during the broadcast. Miss Olivia is putting those together. Before we go any further, how are we doing out there?
Great. So everyone wants to know, how is that name spelled if they want to do their own independent research?
Alvensleben.
There you go.
Elvenschleben. And there's so much about DRAM in the episode that we just did that I recommend after you watch this episode, if you haven't watched the other one, to go back and watch it. But I'm going to do a recap here in the opening about DRAM, D.H. Byrd, LBJ, and an interesting character named James Crichton. And this is going to get us in. I was thinking about the way to kind of maneuver us into this one. And I think it's going to start with LBJ and JFK, because that's where it all spins around after all, because all of the people in question were associated with LBJ, who became the 36th president of the United States after the assassination, when in fact he was headed to prison. And there was a Senate committee that was investigating him, and they were just getting incredible information about bribes and everything else. And then that great caravan presidential motorcade turned on Elm Street, and that was the end of that. All of those went right out the window. But some of his cronies did go to prison, and they decided to spill some beans, including the fact in 1984 that Billy Celestes, a business associate who went to prison, who was a close associate of LBJ's, went to prison in 1964, and he ended up getting out in 1984. And guess what? He decided, I'm going to put it all on the record. And he went to a grand jury and he listed 17 deaths associated with LBJ, in which LBJ was directly implicated in the murders of. And it's interesting because JFK is right on that list, and it gets us into very unusual territory. And I have that grand jury document tonight as well, because that is the background for so many of these associations. And the associations go back over and over again directly to aerospace and the UFO file. It's undeniable. And this opens up the question for us, really: what does the UFO file and the secrecy around the UFO file have to do with presidential assassination, the deep state, and control, and a group that I call X-Protect, that will protect the UFO secret at any cost? We're going to find out about that tonight, and its association with Antarctica. So we're in for a deep ride on this tonight, and I'll tell you, as kind of the next stage of what we released last week, there's more coming, but tonight is going to be explosive. Before we go any further, I want to remind you also to go to darkjournalist.com, especially if you're new here, and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, and it keeps us in touch. It's absolutely, the best way, especially through all the intense censorship, which I've detailed here on this program. But even with the censorship, the newsletter kind of saves us because it gives us that direct pipeline. And we let you know what incredible shows we have coming up for you, X-Series shows, remarkable interviews, things that'll blow your mind coming up very shortly. And events, documentaries, the whole gambit right there at your fingertips. Takes about 20 seconds to sign up at darkjournalist.com. Go ahead, do that. Stand up and be counted and make sure that you're on the newsletter list. We have a fantastic crowd out there tonight already. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get into some of the strange crisscross around LBJ and JFK right off the bat. There's been a lot of books that have come out about LBJ over the years. Some good, some not so good, some remarkable. But what you learn is that sometimes the kind of simple answer that LBJ was the one behind the assassination doesn't work, because you have this whole apparatus of the Central Intelligence Agency and the deep state wanting to remove Kennedy. But Johnson's role is important, and he has to be involved. There's no question about that. Including the fact that he is very, very deep himself in the game of assassination in his own political world. Now, this is someone who was a president of the United States, but even, in private, and Bobby Kennedy publicly referred to LBJ as an animal that ate up people. And Nixon said, of course, he was an animal. So these are people who knew him very intimately. And there's a fascinating story of when Nixon gets the presidency in 1968, LBJ has this meeting and tries to, blackmail him with all these different things, saying, you're going to do this for me, you're going to do that for me, you're going to keep my boys in Texas happy, you're going to keep this and that going. And Nixon says, no, you can't blackmail me. I know all about the Kennedy stuff, so just forget about it. So they faced off like that during the whole presidency. And in fact, LBJ left an X letter that was meant to implicate Richard Nixon to be opened 50 years after his death, after LBJ's death. It turned out that X letter actually, in this series, is something that I've seen as one of those things which is a stealth archive. So the way that stealth archives work, something is on the record. We know that it's there, but we can't get our hands on it. That's the way all of these players like to work. So, for example, the Kennedy JFK assassination records. We know that they're there. We know they implicate the CIA, but we can't do anything about it. We can't get them. And so the X letter for me is very much like that. However, I believe it deals directly with the UFO file. And it was supposed to be released by the LBJ Library this year. Interestingly enough, after Nixon died, there was a false start because they were going to open it up and say, oh, it implicates Nixon and all these things. And I think they were shocked by what they saw in there. And the CIA immediately classified the 4 pages out of 40 that originally came out. So that's gone, whatever that was. And they even list the LBJ library manager who opened it. But as it turns out, the whole thing is supposed to come out. And according to LBJ, he set it up to come out this summer. So it's very odd that it just hangs there in midair, the X letter at the LBJ library. And I've put in an inquiry for them, respectfully, to respond to this. So we'll see what they have to say about it. But for sure, I've seen pictures of the envelope. It exists. A number of researchers know that it's there. Now, here's another interesting thing when we get around this, which is the other things that were supposed to happen in August that didn't. Very, very interesting. Continuity of government leader of Northcom, General Van Herk, was supposed to be switched out for General Gillett. And this was set up and went through the Senate in June, and it was supposed to happen. But there was a holdup by Richard Shelby, who is the Alabama senator. And somehow the whole COG apparatus that was coming in got stalled on August 20th. And it's been stalled since. So we're talking about 3 weeks. This is unusual activity. Oddly enough, there's a, before we jump in on all this, but we're going to find COG is directly related and unfortunately still very much in the game today, and seems to have only built its power in. But there's an interesting thing that came out, which is U.S. Northern Command Post, and it says, this is from August 23rd. Now, the switchover was supposed to happen on the 20th. General Glenn Van Herk, who, if you've watched this program, you're very familiar with, he's the Northcom NORAD commander who claimed he was shooting down UFOs back in February when we had the Chinese balloon incidents. General Van Herk, commander, North American Aerospace Defense Command and U.S. Northern Command, the COG commander, welcomes nearly 30 National Guard, Army, and Air Force lieutenant colonels and above to the U.S. Northcom Dual Status Command course. At the NORAD U.S. Northcom headquarters, Peterson Space Force Base, Colorado, August 22nd, 2023, Van Herk discussed with the group how they would fit into U.S. Northcom chain of command if they were activated to fill the DSC role. That is, if COG was activated and we had regional governors, they'd need all these groups to go out and secure different territories. The National Defense Authorization Act, signed in December 2011, facilitated the use of DSCs to provide unity of effort between state and federal forces in achieving common objectives in a disaster response or in supporting a national event. So, you have what it used to be with COG is you had a nuclear event and then COG got activated. This guy, the combatant commander of the United States, the Northcom leader, which we got after 9/11. It's a completely unconstitutional process. This guy takes over and he appoints regional governors. So, the Eastern region gets these people and all the rest. And the military takes over. They secure the situation and, allow for another election. This is very interesting that this whole process got shaken up about him getting replaced. And then he's teaching now these DSC people what it's going to be like if they split the command and DSC does kind of a co-program with Northcom on taking over. It's an odd thing, let's say, first of all, for Van Herk to still be there. He's supposed to be replaced by Gillett, as I mentioned, and then for him to be giving this briefing. Oddly enough, Van Herk also shot his mouth off about Space Command recently, and very unusually, he said that Space Command was deceptive, quote unquote. That's pretty heavy language for those guys. I mean, they handle ICBMs and stuff. Deceptive? That's kind of tricky.
Olive Eisner says, why did Van Herk get replaced? Do we know?
I think it's because Biden didn't want someone from the Trump administration being the Northcom commander. But it's a fast replacement. And Van Herk's pretty young. I think he's 55 years old. Here's a little bit about Shelby holding it all up. And Shelby is a Republican from Alabama. For all we know, this is an interesting sign that something is going on in the background in the power struggle. And we can see a shot of Shelby there. But I'll read a little bit about this. U.S. military has a problem. Its cause is not a Chinese surveillance balloon. And this is a recent article, even though they're talking about that. It is the U.S. Congress, the 535 democratically elected representatives, with funding and approving policy for the nation's defense. Congress has embarrassed itself multiple times during the last 2 decades by failing to approve annual deficit spending and defense spending for the new fiscal year, forcing the Pentagon to rely on stopgap funding. Now, a freshman senator from Alabama is setting a dangerous precedent in this process. Senator Tommy Tuberville, a Republican, has put a procedural hold on the nomination of more than 300 military officers, Navy and Marine Corps, with no confirmed chief. The former football coach at Auburn University is taking issues, and he's creating a false reason. Now, I'm not so sure that this is a bad thing. And so But it is true that Tuberville is taking the lead on it. Shelby, there is a piece of this that's associated with Shelby. Aviation Week is not in the business of weighing in on social issues, and we are not about to start to, but we cannot ignore that Tuberville is holding and inflicting U.S. military apparatus after 5 months. And so on it goes. Now, this is not to emphasize the impact of Tuberville's hold. The Pentagon will find a way to function, and so on and so forth. But they are holding up that entire COG switchover. And in the process, they're holding up everything else, including all these appointments that our friend Biden has made. Now, the Biden administration, they may realize that the Biden administration is in such a legal trouble from the Hunter scandals and for other things that are arising, including his obvious mental problems, shall we say. So what they may be doing is looking at a situation here where they know the leadership is going to be switched out. So therefore, they don't want to activate what he put in because it only gives more power to this thing that's going down. And I think that's what is behind Tuberville on this. Watch that situation closely because the COG commander is in the crucial role here, especially with all the difficulties that we have in relation to the DOJ interference in the election in for 2024. And if we look at this, it's been now over 20 years since we've had Northcom there. Totally unconstitutional aberration that just came into place and was called into being by a system that had failed constitutionally and decided, we're going to scare everyone with this terrorist threat. We're going to create this military unit to run the United States and just have it there ready to run things. And in fact, it's very disturbing from a constitutional point of view, but it's been in place since September 11th, which of course the anniversary is coming up on Monday.
Mm-hmm.
Unbelievable. And 22 years and not a whole lot of answers forthcoming. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is DRAM, JFK Assassination Aerospace, Antarctica, and the UFO File. This process that the deep state has been involved in has gone on for a long, long time. And we can at least chart it from the National Security Act post-World War II and the absolute earthquake, or what Professor Scott refers to as the first deep state revolt against the White House, which is the assassination of President Kennedy. All these factors are involved with this covert government subverting the overt government and reaching in. So I want to give us a background on this. Of course, I always refer back to Professor Scott. And whenever we're speaking about the deep state, deep events, continuity of government for the most part, this is all coming out of the research of Professor Scott, who, it's interesting, his work is so much more, it was so ahead of its time that even when I've done interviews with him over the years, he's been so far ahead of his time that it's only now that the world is kind of catching up to the information he put on the record. But one of the things that he found there singularly, that he pointed out over and over again, is this role of the continuity of government, which is a completely, it's an agency that acts with no oversight, vast resources, underground bases, space stations, you name it. And the role of the secret space program rolled into that. It's just too much power to give to an organization that was created by Eisenhower and Truman to survive a very real threat of nuclear decapitation of the leadership. So that process was double down, and finally just becomes its very own power base. That's what we're looking at as we get into things like the UFO threat, and we get into things like the deep state creating chaos, cyber attack, a nuclear incident, whatever it is. That's all to activate this continuity of government button. And once you do that, all bets are off because you suspend the Constitution. And every year, the president, whether it's Trump or Obama or Stepford Biden, they have to sign on to that September 11th emergency that includes continuity of government, Northcom, and all that stuff. And if they don't, they're holding up all of the national defense NDAA money, and that's close to $1 trillion. Now, recently, Senators Gillibrand and Rubio have thrown in to that the UFO Defense Office, UFO DOE, as it were, Arrow, as they call it. And now that is also included in NDAA, meaning if you try to obstruct that office, if you try to stop it, you're going to hold up $1 trillion in funding and everybody's going to hit the ceiling. So this is a very clever maneuver, but over and over again, we find the government being taken hostage by this NDAA. That whole process needs to be investigated and explored. As for the backdoor deals that are going on, that's what I have to say about it. Let's hear from Professor himself and what he has to say about it. This is from the Deep State Revolt, the first Deep State Revolt against the White House, Dallas, 1963. Professor Scott, my favorite book of his is American Deep State and JFK, Deep Politics and the JFK Assassination. Those books are foundational if you want to understand how the government and deep state interface happens. And in fact, Professor Scott coined the term deep state. All right. Since writing these chapters, I've come more and more to analyze recent American history in the light of what I call structural deep events like the JFK assassination, Watergate break-in, Iran-Contra, or 9/11, which repeatedly involve law breaking or violence, are mysterious to begin with, are embedding an ongoing covert process having political consequences that enlarge covert government and are subsequently covered up by the systematic falsifications in the mainstream media and internal government records. The more I study these deep events, the more I see suggestive similarities between them, increasing the possibility that they are not unrelated external intrusions on American history, but parts of an endemic process sharing to some degree or other elements from a common source. For example, one factor linking Dallas 63, Watergate, Iran-Contra, and 9/11 has been the involvement in all four deep events of personnel involved in America's highest level emergency planning, known since the 1950s as continuity of government, or COG planning, or more colloquially inside the Pentagon as the Doomsday Project. A few of these actors may have been located at the top as overseers of the secret COG system. Others, including some I shall discuss in this chapter, were located further down in its secret communications network. So when we get into incidents like, say, in the 80s, Iran-Contra, and all the strange things that happened, that somehow we were able to take government money, send it to the Iranians, who were supposed to be our enemy, and have the Iranians then spend it on arms, and we would trade arms with them eventually. But then they would funnel that money back from the arms sales to the Contras. That whole thing is one aspect of this process that took place under the Reagan administration. But Iran-Contra actually represented this deeper system, and it had a lot to do with space and SDI as well. Those parts were left out conveniently, but continuity of government did come up during the congressional hearings, and everybody hit the ceiling. They hit the roof as soon as it came up, and it came right out of the mouth of Oliver North, of course, who was the conduit of all these things. And he said, well, I need to talk about the continuity of government, program. And his own lawyer, a civilian, said, no, you can't do that. And then the senators stood up and said, no, how dare you? So we knew that there was something wrong then. In that process and overlap of time, when you got to 2020 and COVID and all that, you had figures like Nancy Pelosi, who wonderfully and with such enthusiasm just said she's going to run for re-election again next year.
Mhm.
Gonna have to check in with AA first, I guess. That's worth a guffaw.
I know.
Right there.
Everyone is saying she suddenly looks so refreshed.
Well, let's just say that we have a real spectacle going on there in the Senate and in Congress. Like Fetterman, for example,
Mhm.
our friend Stepford Biden. It's almost intentional, as if to say, the dumber they are, the more vacant they are, the better the puppet they are for us. And so they are playing us in that sense. It's just the entrenched power holding on. But I see a lot of that, the potential of a lot of that getting thrown out. So we'll talk about that tonight as well. But let's go back to this deep event aspect and personnel for a moment. So, everywhere in these major events that have shocked history, from 9/11 to the JFK assassination, the financial coup d'etat of 2008, um, the October surprise with the Carter administration, Watergate, all these different things all involve at their core level COG personnel. That's crucial because we start to understand that the motivation is to step in from this covert system into the overt system, accomplish a policy change, and then step back. And then we deal with all the rebel. There's a lot of debris from all this that takes place, and we're stuck with it, sifting through it for time. But one of the things when they leave that kind of a footprint, they let us know that there's a lawless system right underneath this system, the public system. And when it bleeds over, you get a look at it, get a glimpse of it. And when you do, if you're able to analyze it properly, you can set up the right kind of investigatory defenses against it. So understanding what it is and that it's there, I think is important. Not chasing ghosts, but watching an actual organization, a system inside the government, step in and do these different things. Professor Scott, through his research, traced it all back to COG. This is a crucial realization because it's the emergency powers that are necessary for them to accomplish these things, because you can't do these things under normal constitutional rule. And with so much lawlessness that we see going on now, I saw today that they introduced a bill to become a law in California that if you don't affirm your child's gender, the states just take it away. Well, that's, Stasi tactic. And, that puts us on the level of the Nazis and the Gestapo and all the rest of it. So those types of things are moving in, and they're coming in from some kind of a system here. And the way to track it in the case of what's happening with the emergency powers and geopolitical situation is to say that these groups that are trying to centralize power more and more lose the ability to command majorities that they would need to govern. And what ends up happening inevitably is they have to resort to emergency situations. Just like the 9/11 emergency, you never could have gotten Homeland Security without it, for example, the TSA. These things would have never existed. But you needed the problem reaction solution in so many of these events. But if you look at 9/11, in fact, and you look at this organization, the Department of Homeland Security, which is getting very interested in the UFO file, by the way, they now have amassed 250,000 employees. So think about the government power inside of one organization, and just think of those people. Think about how many people and what it would look like for 250,000 people. That's what DHS has at its command. When did we decide to fund all that? Well, it's just grown with the NDA. Everything grows with the NDAA. And it's interesting because once you insert it in there, like I said, you can't take it out, and because if you do, you're blocking all this other funding. So they've secured this mechanism, and deep in the heart of that, as we go deep in the heart of Texas tonight in this episode, deep in the heart of that process is the continuity of government program. Now, whenever we see things around the continuity of government program, like them saying, hey, we just shot down UFOs, those are weird trial balloons, and they only started that this year. In fact, the COG used to be so hidden before COVID that it's remarkable that we see them, parading around or doing interviews. They never used to do any of this stuff. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here tonight going deep on DRAM. That is Werner von Elvensleben. This is the Nazi assassin who was converted into a CIA officer and then found himself chumming up with the owner of the Texas School Book Depository, going on safari with him in 1963. And we're going to explore that deeper as we got into it last week. But I think the good kind of foundational understanding, when we get into it tonight, we're going to find out that a lot of these people, including Byrd, again, the ring of aerospace and continuity of government is there, opening things up for us to give us some idea what's happening. I mentioned earlier we're going to take your questions in the second part of tonight's program. So make sure you have those ready. Miss Olivia will take them and put them together. We'll do that in about an hour or so. How are you
Sounds
doing over
good.
there?
Good. We've got some great questions and comments about LBJ. Secret Spaceship says Malcolm Wallace was LBJ's hitman.
Oh, don't worry.
We're gonna
he's
get
deep,
into that?
He's deep in there tonight.
Okay, great.
Good old Mac. Yeah, undeniable. And Mac is a triple threat too, because he's aerospace, assassination, and LBJ. He's like, that's a lot of this tonight. What else you got?
Devlin Liam McGregor says LBJ rose to power through crime when the Operation Paperclip Money Group settled in Texas, followed the money. And James Forrestal was, quote, suicided a week after LBJ visited him also.
Yeah, it's interesting what happens to people after LBJ visits them.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a visit to LBJ by Nixon. I was thinking about something with Nixon, and this is random, but think about this for one individual. He runs against JFK, and JFK beats him by surprise because the odds are that Nixon is supposed to win. He has the incumbency and everything else. But JFK secures the victory, and he's assassinated. Nixon then runs in 68, and his opponent is going to be Bobby Kennedy, who's sweeping all the primaries. He gets assassinated. And then MLK, who was supporting Bobby, he gets assassinated. And then in 1972, when George Wallace is running, Wallace is going to steal a lot of Republican support. So they think he gets shot, but he lives. So it's just weird that if you just follow this one character of Nixon around, you're going to run into all kinds of interesting things. But what you find over and over again is his opponents are assassinated. It's a little bit unusual, wouldn't you think? Yeah. What's weird is the vice president Ford that he picks, who succeeds him in 1974. This is interesting too. There are actually multiple attempts on Ford's life in that very short presidency of less than 2 years. And his vice president is Nelson Rockefeller.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just say there are a lot of things going on in terms of maneuvering there, which exposed the group that was operating with this. Here's another thing to consider about the JFK assassination. It's been investigated 5 times on a government level by committees. That's pretty amazing if you think about it. You'd think you'd be able to achieve the answer with one investigation. 5 times. And we still don't have the records and none of the answers 60 years later. Well, we'll provide some of those answers tonight, but on a government level, forget it. So for the people who think the government would ever give them UFO disclosure, or that the CIA will be Big Daddy and help move the world forward by showing them aliens, it's the craziest notion ever. As a matter of fact, I collected a number of articles over the years about the CIA getting roasted by different types of legal authorities for constantly flouting the law. They have no interest in following the law. And in fact, there's a charter, which none of us are able to see, but basically what it says in that charter from the government is that the CIA, if they're engaged in criminal acts or if they're engaged in witnessing criminal acts, don't have to come forward with any of that information. So basically it's just a lawless organization sitting there as we call ourselves, this successful democratic republic. And we have something that Harry Truman calls these are really good terms. Truman, had very strong feelings about not starting it, but he called it a super Gestapo. Think about that. Not just the Gestapo, but super Gestapo. And in fact, when Kennedy was assassinated, a month to the day, Truman wrote an editorial in the Washington Post that said CIA, mend it or end it, because it was never supposed to be what it is. And, it's going to have to be dissolved or they're going to have to remake it. So this is crucial because, of course, he was the individual who set it up, and it was forced upon him. And he comes in without a lot of knowledge because he had just been vice president for 3 months. And supposedly FDR was forced to choose him. And so he didn't really want anything to do with him. So he didn't share a lot of secrets. So when he gets in there, he's sort of looking around like, where, the deep state is controlling everything. What am I supposed to do? And so Truman's an unusual figure in all this, so that by the end, even though in the beginning he's kind of a puppet of this whole system, by the end of his presidency, he sees the bigger picture. And by the time Kennedy's in, he really calls out the actions of the government taking over on that level. We're going to get into some of the setup of the CIA as well tonight. Let's go and mention this before we start in earnest tonight, which is that Bobby Kennedy is out there and he's had kind of a running start to the fall, but he did something quite amazing just yesterday. He went on the record and said, it looks like the DNC has changed the rules. So if I win in New Hampshire and Iowa, because they've tried to change the schedule, that they'll actually give my delegates to Biden. And so he's realizing that they're cooking it against him, that even if he won, 80% of the primaries, they still wouldn't give it to him. They'll just give the delegates to Biden. So he said, I may need to seek an alternative route. This is crucial and will shake up the entire system of the 2024 election. So this is something that I think is a remarkable change here. I want us all to keep it in mind. And of course, Bobby has the connections. He has the history. He has the knowledge to be a really great president. So he's definitely one to watch. And on the other side, of course, Trump, floating around in the 60s and the 70s in the, great poll numbers that he's doing. And it's interesting, too, because they threw everything at him and his poll numbers have been fantastic. He's going to face big time legal challenges. They're going to try to do things like knock him off ballots. It's really dirty tricks. And it's going to put us into a kind of a constitutional crisis situation, the way that they do this through the justice system. But nonetheless, Trump as the factor, RFK as the factor going forward, you can feel the momentum between the two of them rising and Biden falling. It's just inevitable. So they're thinking of what can we do with Biden? And so there's all kinds of rumors floating about what they might do. Yeah.
Considering that people traditionally, historically, have voted their their pocketbook, and it's the economy stupid, right? I mean, how on earth do they think they can, without cheating, outright cheating, get Biden elected? Just Trump derangement syndrome?
Well, they can't pull off what they did with the mailing ballots and COVID last time. So what do you do? Either you call some kind of emergency situation, you lead us into some kind of war footing to get more support for the presidency. But the fact is that people do remember, for whatever things that Trump that they didn't like about him, that his economy was fantastic. And when they think about that in comparison with the inflation driven piece and just the out of control wokeism associated with this administration, when it comes to polls over and over again, you see very little support. What's interesting is they've been able to keep their standing with certain women who hold certain types of views. And it's interesting because I think more and more as that comes off, the veneer around the Biden administration, we're going to see that group, these demographics of women turning more and more on the Biden administration. And what's interesting is in minority numbers, they're turning against the Biden. So, that whole Biden push is in very dangerous territory. And I think that Bobby Kennedy running in the first place has shaken things up. But he went on the record saying, look, I'm not a protest candidate. I'm in it to win it. And if they are robbing me of the ability to do this and having a fair fight, then I'm going to seek an alternative means. Now, there are a couple of different independent presidential parties, the Independent Party and this No Labels Party, which did put themselves wisely on the ballot in all the states. They would love to have someone like that. The other thing that's interesting, Bobby couldn't run on this, but you have to think about it. It's the Libertarian Party. They have all the apparatus. They're set up on every ballot in every state and all the rest of it. And you never see them crack 3%, in a presidential election. Maybe they should start to think about that or throw their weight behind a candidate who can really fulfill some of the ideals that they have. But it's going to be a wild ride. And I'm thinking more and more when we get into 2024, we have the time to set it up now mentally and get a handle on what's happening because it's going to be crazy. And I've predicted front and center is going to be the UFO file in 2024. Make no mistake about it. So my advice to the Bobby camp and to the Trump camp, you know very much. You have a lot of intel about it. Start to lay it out. Don't let this government get the jump on you. Put it out there. Talk to your followers directly about it and deal with it now before those guys run away with the CIA UFO threat piece. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. JFK Aerospace, Antarctica, DRAM, UFO file. We're going to go deep here tonight. And we've already set up the basis for the continuity of government program, which, let's face it, is just martial law under a fancy name. But it's an apparatus, it's a system, bringing in hundreds of billions of dollars every year, and hundreds of thousands of employees, and an entire system that we never get to see. And there's very, very little, if any, oversight regarding it. What's going on there in relation to that? We're going to get into it tonight. And we're going to tie in these pieces of D.H. Byrd, the owner of the Texas School Book Depository, his famous cousin, Admiral Byrd of Antarctica fame. And the piece that really opens all this up, which is the connection of that aerospace aspect connected to this, and how does the International Geophysical Year figure in? Well, we're going to figure out how that works. What do you got there?
I'm sorry. Olive Eisner said Dick Cheney came out today bashing Trump as the biggest threat to the United States in over 200 years. Insane. If that's true, if Dick Cheney, who is, Darth
Captain
Vader,
of COG,
if he says Trump is the worst, I mean, it tempts me to vote for Trump 100%.
Yeah. What you see in the presence of Liz Cheney doesn't have any support from anywhere. She lost her own district congressionally with 28% of the vote. I mean, it's terrible. And her presence out there, and the fact of, Newsweek being like, oh, she could be a potent challenger against Trump and all this stuff. But she's the presence. She's the living epitome of the continuity of government people, because her dad set it up. And the version of COG that these set up, because you could actually look at COG and think of it, as this innocent national security objective in the 50s and stuff, fighting off against nuclear war. When you get to 1988, this is a crucial year. This is when Cheney and Rumsfeld and North are all involved in this apparatus, and they change, and Vice President Bush, who becomes President Bush in 1988, they change the meaning from nuclear event to any emergency. That's the crucial switch and the change. And in fact, they activated COG on 9/11. So there's a trail of that in the 9/11 Commission, but they didn't want to go any further. But it mentioned, and it got into this Doomsday Communications Network. And Professor Scott, for his work, he puts a special emphasis on that communications network. And I've understood it more and more over time, because those communications are outside of the dial tone of the NSA. They are completely secured communications because they're meant to be used in the event of some calamity. And so there's no record of those conversations. There's no tracking of them, et cetera. So therefore, these types of deals can be set up in those, the Doomsday Network, which is meant to be, hey, we've just been decapitated by a separate nuclear power. We have an underground government running things. This gets into very interesting territory tonight. JFK and LBJ and the COG aspect comes right into the assassination as well. But their relationship is very complex because he was forced on the ticket as the Senate Majority Leader. And it was a weird thing for him because he had so much power, LBJ as Senate Majority Leader. But there was a series of things, including blackmail, that got him on the ticket in the first place. And when he was asked by a friend who recounted this later, an aide, said, why would you want to be vice president? We know that they have no power. Look at Nixon under Eisenhower, And he said, Kennedy's not going to live very long. And the friend assumed, oh, he must, he tried to push this thing about Kennedy being in poor health during the election. That must be it. But no, he knew otherwise. So the role of the assassination was already, the idea of this being his road to the presidency is something that was already on his mind very much. There were strange outbursts with LBJ at times in public. And there are occasions of Kennedy having to calm him down and him really just showing his freaky side, attacking people and flipping out. There's a number of these occasions which show the instability of LBJ as well, and his desire to humiliate other people. And it's interesting because Bill Moyers, who was this guy for years who did specials on PBS and all the rest, and he was also the president of the Council of Foreign Relations for a while, but a big media figure for sure. If you go back in history, he was a special counsel to the president during the assassination. And he mused to a friend in the late 60s, if people really knew that there's an absolute lunatic running this country, I wonder what would happen. It's like revolution would break out. But he knew. And he never went on the record about it, nor did he go on the record about LBJ's role in the assassination. And for me, it's a very interesting that there are these characters out there who went through this stuff and then reinvented themselves later as these media figures, but they came out of this and they knew all about LBJ and his issues. LBJ came out of a very sketchy system in Texas at the time. Of course, so many different states have a sketchy system when it comes politically, but in Texas at the time, so many things were accomplished, by insiders. And he got into the Senate with less than 110 votes. And those votes were magically found in this famous election. And that's how he got in. And he was used. He made himself available to all the right people. And on the military side, he just, put himself out there and said, I'm your guy. And it's an interesting point that in the 1950s, as Senate Majority Leader, LBJ had the nickname Senator NASA. This is very important because we have to understand when we're looking at him, you're not just looking at entrenched oil corruption or Texas or whatever. It's aerospace. That's what we're talking about. That's where his roots are, interestingly enough. And that's where his power base is. And all of the things that he's able to wield to get into power come directly out of that apparatus, including the presence of D.H. Byrd, who was a major funder for LBJ. So there's a very interesting crime that occurs that threatens to kind of shake up his position. And it's very interesting. That's a shot of him there with D.H. Byrd. And this is shortly before LBJ died, but they were great friends. In fact, Byrd used to land his plane on LBJ's ranch all the time. And he mentions very openly in his book, hey, LBJ was a great friend of mine. And it just so happens that he owned the Texas School Book Depository. Well, it's also interesting that it's not just Johnson that Byrd is close to, but Byrd is close to Connally. He's close to Clint Murchison. He is in the Dallas Petroleum Club, which he has all this association with George de Montchil, who's this oil geologist who becomes Oswald's handler. And so we see a whole structure there. And in the middle of it is a CIA director named David Atlee Phillips, who is out of Fort Worth and is part of this petroleum club. He will become a central figure in all of this around the assassination. But here you have, in this very special group that they called 8F, that Byrd and Johnson and Connally are all a part of, you have aerospace represented. You have the Senator NASA involved. You have oil money and all the rest of that. You have paperclip represented. And so the forces that will be involved in the assassination take in some part directly in those 8F meetings. And that 8F group is a small elite group that meets to kind of expand the power base of these various things that they're involved in. Now, what you'll find is when you look at D.H. Byrd's role, that he set up the Civil Air Patrol, and that might just sound like, hey, it's some patriotic thing where he wants to teach us to, common people to fly planes in case there's a commie attack, something like that. But it gives you something else. It gives you the ability to surveil things from the air. with a perfectly good cover. And one of the interesting things that de Mohrenschildt shows up with, and he's such a key figure around the assassination, is that yes, he's an oil geologist, and he's involved in all these strange, things like walking tours through these countries, and the leaders get overthrown right after he goes over there under the cover of taking a walking tour. So he's a very unusual figure, and who he's working for becomes very, very suspect. But in any case, this is someone who shows up right in the center of all this. But his other great specialty is aerial surveillance. So we have these people who have a reason to use aerial surveillance. I'm looking for an oil field. I'm practicing civil air defense. But they're getting a mastery over the air, and this becomes very important. Now, in the traditional story around the Kennedy assassination, it's just dumb luck that there's a defector who's in love with the Soviet Union, who just happens to get a job on the route that President Kennedy is going to go by his window in 6 weeks. And he just happens to bring his rifle in and, get a lucky shot of 7 wounds with 1 bullet and all that stuff. So that's the junk that they sold us in that period of time. And then they had Oswald be silenced by Jack Ruby. And so the way that they were able to play it out to the public was, oh, you have this lone crazy guy who did this. Don't look into his past because it might get us into a war, World War III, because he loved the Soviet Union. And then the person who bumped him off was someone who had a patriotic duty to kill that person who assassinated the president. That's the phony story that they stuck with. But the minute you get in even a half inch deep, you realize that one, Oswald was associated with Guy Bannister, who is the person who set up the UFO file for the FBI. And he's working for him, and he's an ultra right winger. So that destroys any fantasy about Oswald being an agent of communism. Second, there's the whole trail that's come out now of Oswald's association with the CIA. Now, back then, it was easy to say that. People questioned it, but you couldn't prove it. Now the proof is on the table, but the proof of the CIA, firing the shots is the thing that lies in the files. And this is the thing that we can put on the record here. But the reason for the CIA doing that, although a number of things have been put out in relation to that, and of course, Kennedy firing the top line of the CIA because of their out of control posture, unconstitutional, overthrowing of governments, and a number of things. And he just felt, look, they try to get me into a war. They try to get me bombing Cuba, you're out. And once he did that, they had probably sized him up that they were going to go down this road with him anyway, but that certainly was the nail in the coffin for the assassination plans. Now, when we say CIA, we have to remember the deep state aspect in relation to this, because they're a crucial part of the deep state. But CIA, the way that it's used is actually incorrect very often, because it's thought of as a military apparatus. But in fact, it was cooked up in a legal firm. And the lawyer's name was Alan Dulles. And it's interesting because it was set up by lawyers dealing out of Manhattan, dealing with international finance. This is the crucial link. And then the intelligence gathering apparatus that we had, the OSS, and then various counterparts, when we took over Germany and took over their intelligence gathering apparatus, it meant in essence that we were getting, in the early CIA setup, Nazi intelligence for setting it up. Now, this is not a slight on the United States, because of course Russia tried to get all the Germans too. Everybody tried to get the assets and the intellectual assets and the political assets of Nazi Germany after it fell. And so they absorbed a certain amount of Nazi mentality in their science. And we got our fair share of that too. I think the problem is that apparatus worked strongly through our government programs, which were completely and utterly opposed to any kind of Nazi. The Constitution is about as opposite of the Nazi Party position and dogma as you can get. So the problem is of taking in this kind of martial philosophy and it remolding aspects of our own constitutional republic. This is the great danger when we were dealing with this. But by the time you get to Kennedy's period, he's already starting to see that the Central Intelligence Agency is out of control. And one of the things he wants to do is bring back secret projects back under executive control. And a major piece of those projects involves aerospace. That's where you get the moon missions and these various things. He's seeing a way of reworking this map that they've been conducting nonstop Cold War. They've been making untold profits. They've been making the United States the enemy of all these different countries. And all these revolutions have been springing up everywhere that the Russians can go around and say, the United States, like they want to overthrow your leaders. We'll give you arms and money. And so this is the nature of the situation. He thinks the way to stop it is not to go in and take over every place or launch covert ops all over the world, but is to change the image of the United States across the world. And so he creates things like the Peace Corps, and he opens us up to the space program, not as a means of superior weaponry, where we're going to display our weapons as they did in the Soviet Union with this nuclear missile going by during the parade. But it's going to give us a global moon mission, like we're going to go with the Russians together to the moon. So inside of his own national security structure are people who were former Nazis who become, patriotic, quote unquote, Americans. And they're looking at that and saying, well, we killed 25 million Russians. Like, we're not going to share the secrets that we have in relation to the UFO file, the X technology, and all the rest of it, because this guy has some global vision of freedom. Forget about it. And Kennedy is seeing, even with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the very real potentiality of nuclear war. And he's saying we need something far beyond, the old practices of standoffs and calling each other out and all the rest of it. Because when you're doing that on a nuclear level, you're going to destroy the world. And so in his speech at American University in June of 1963, he says, we can't afford to ever have a war where even the fruits of victory will be ashes in our mouth. So signaling this posture to the world and to the Russians, it makes him, they say that the speech at American University is when the deep state really decided this is it. And he made the speech. It's very interesting. I make the point that he goes around the State Department, he goes around the CIA, and they have a different copy of the speech he's going to give. And he gives a totally different speech. So when they're listening to it, like Eisenhower in 1961, leaving office, saying we need to be leery of the military industrial complex, they have gone outside of the channels and they've assumed the real role of the presidency. They're not controlled puppets by their own State Department or intelligence apparatus. So these people and the power that they've been able to amass under the intelligence agencies and the deep state since World War II is really under threat when Kennedy gets in. But the central place, although people like to point out it's financial, and it's not, it's the Federal Reserve and all these different things. It's true that there are all these areas where Kennedy is threatening them, but the singular area that they have decided, to really stake a claim to is this idea of control and war from space. That's where the aspect of Kennedy coming in with a peace program around this and sharing our UFO file with the Russians. That's the major break in the communication of this network. They decide that's when we have to take them out. Now, there's a very interesting crisscross tonight that we'll get into, because in this program, it's back a few years now, which is Douglas Caddy has gone on the record several times saying that E. Howard Hunt, who was his friend, and Douglas Caddy is the Watergate lawyer, but E. Howard Hunt told him that Kennedy was assassinated in private, not for public display, but told him the reason John Kennedy was assassinated was because of the UFO file, because he wanted to share it with the Russians. That piece that Caddy gave us on the record is such an opens up so many things when you compare it with the levels of evidence that we have that the UFO file is right at the heart of the battle of the Central Intelligence Agency with President Kennedy. So we're getting into that tonight and open up the question around the JFK assassination aerospace plot, and that is Antarctica, the UFO file, and DRAM. It's all there, and LBJ is right in the middle of it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of tonight's program, but we got a lot to get through. In the meantime, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Dixie 504 says, I thought the CIA wasn't supposed to act domestically. John Howard says they're in partnership with other Five Eyes countries to do the direct work. And Fuber Fighter says, didn't the Galen organization split fairly evenly between the USSR and the USA?
Well, I think that there was an advantage because Galen went into the mountains to hide. And as soon as he knew he had some kind of a deal with the Americans, he was like, all right, all my records are here, here, and here. But the Germans were fighting the Russians. And so, although we were with the Russians to fight the Germans, by the time we get on the other side of that, now we're against the Russians and we're with these Germans, the West Germans. And so that whole apparatus then of the intelligence network against the Russians is something that we need. That's how Galen, General Galen, and his Nazi ideals slip in there. Don't get me wrong, any country in that position would take the superior intellectual assets of the other country, the scientists and all the different things that they had developed, the V2, to make ICBMs and all that. It's not anything that should be too surprising on that level. What the problem is, there's their own secrecy. And I'm going to get into that tonight because Paperclip brought in with it its own secrets. They had kind of escaped death and the judgment at Nuremberg, and now they've embedded themselves in this new system. You know, they pledge allegiance to the flag. But in fact, when they're down there and they get set up in Alabama, in Huntsville, and there are these pictures when they first get there, and they're able to roll out all the Nazi regalia and all the rest of it, you know, and there are these pictures of them hanging out at this cabin with the big Nazi thing hanging down. So they've maintained their martial philosophy coming in with this. That's basically part of the problem. Other unusual things as well. So let's get into this, something that opens up the whole program, which is a strange murder that shows up, and it's done by someone who is known as an LBJ hitman and one of LBJ's goons. And it's an early killing, and LBJ is a senator. And in fact, LBJ has a sister named Josepha, and she's dating a golf pro, a guy named Douglas Kinzer. And LBJ feels that, you know, she has loose lips, basically. And so
she's a loose woman and she drinks a lot.
So there's a whole thing about Mac Wallace and the situation. And Mac Wallace, long story short, goes in there and shoots the golf pro. Now, it's interesting because he's identified immediately, and when he's grabbed, he says, I know Senator Johnson. So there's a whole process of his trial and all the rest of it. And then it looks like an open and shut case. He's going to jail. But LBJ applies pressure, and the case takes place in the very early 1950s. This is before Johnson is anywhere near being VP for Kennedy. And what happens is he applies the pressure, and somehow there's threats to the jury, and the judge lets Malcolm Wallace off with no time, just time served. And he walks. Now,
although he's convicted of murder.
Yes, he's convicted of murder, and it's time served, and you know, he's free to go. He's going to show up right in the center of the JFK assassination, oddly enough, through the vigorous work of these various researchers, by the fact that there was a fingerprint found in the sniper's nest, so-called, of the Texas School Book Depository. And all of the fingerprints were eliminated, and there was only one that was remaining that anyone knew anything about. Of course, there's no fingerprints of Oswald in the sniper's nest. So that fingerprint, a researcher got his hands on and sat on it, because when Mac Wallace was arrested for the murder of Douglas Kinzer, he had to be fingerprinted. And so his fingerprints would become up for grabs at a certain point. That researcher waited around for years until this happened. Then he got his hands on the fingerprint, put the two out, and it came to be this whole situation. He got somebody who had worked in fingerprints for 40 years to confirm that it was Mac Wallace's fingerprint. This is very interesting for a lot of reasons. The media silence on it, and then there was an expose that an English director did for a program called The Men Who Killed Kennedy, The Guilty Men, which is the last stage. They'd been doing those shows for over a decade. And in fact, it was played on American TV. And then there was an incredible outcry from former President Gerald Ford, former President Bill Clinton, Lady Bird Johnson's estate, the whole thing. Everybody went after the History Channel and they sued them. So they banned The Men Who Killed Kennedy. Now, let's get into a few things about this case, because it involves the death of an official that this is another death done by Mac Wallace. This is the original one, as we just mentioned, him shooting the Gulf Pro, Kinzer, of which he served no time. Now, before I get into his next killing, which is of Henry Marshall on the record, there's an interesting thing that happens. As I said, around the time that LBJ was about to become president through the assassination of President Kennedy, it's a very interesting sequence of events, because a lot of his friends are under indictment or already in prison. So Bobby Baker, who he did all these deals with in the Senate, he's going to supposedly spill to avoid prison. Eventually he does go to prison, but he's supposed to spill on LBJ. So if LBJ doesn't get into that presidency, he's finished. JFK has already assumed another, supposedly Terry Sanford of North Carolina was going to be the vice president in 1964. And Nixon, when he's there the day before Kennedy's assassinated in Dallas during a press conference, says, everyone already knows that LBJ is out in 1964. So it was in the air. So really, LBJ is also watching the fact that Bobby Kennedy has been kind of in the background helping some of these legal pieces about LBJ. And he is thinking to himself, Bobby Kennedy is the one who's really going to sink me. So he's in this, crazy situation where if he doesn't participate in this plot and become president, that he's ready to be put in prison. And there are a number of bribe scandals, etc. The person who goes on the record later talking about the crimes of LBJ is Billy Celestes. And Celestes is fascinating. He's the one who tells LBJ, look, you have this agricultural official and he's not playing ball. And, he's involved in this scheme, Celestes, of saying that there are all these things related to agriculture, like these tanks of fertilizer, and getting loans on them, but they don't exist. Very much like what HUD will be set up to do later under LBJ. Now, what happens is he takes the fall and LBJ can't do anything about it because he'll expose himself. And so there's a kind of a bitterness that grows over time. And also Celestes understood what a rat that LBJ was and didn't want him to get away with it. In 1984, he goes before a grand jury and he says that he's willing to go on the record about these crimes that LBJ committed, including the killing of Henry Marshall, who's the agricultural official. Josepha Johnson, which is his own sister, is on that list. And at the very bottom of the list is there, if you read it, President John F. Kennedy. So this is Billy Celestes' list to the grand jury in Texas saying, I'm involved in this case. If you will grant me immunity for all the things that I know about Kennedy being killed and about Johnson ordering the deaths of these 17 other people, I'll tell you everything I know. And the grand jury weighs it for a while, and there's a whole hubbub that goes on, and then the whole thing is dialed back. They say, no, we can't guarantee you anything, but we'll listen to whatever you have to say. And then he never goes on the record. Interestingly enough, it's Douglas Caddy who becomes his lawyer in the middle of all that. So Caddy is, always in those very, very interesting, important positions. In the know, as shall we say. So when we're looking at that, let's remember too that Celestes has gone on the record. So he's gone on the record there also saying that this gentleman, Henry Marshall, the tall gentleman here, was an agricultural official that figured out the scheme that Celestes and Johnson were running and didn't want to go along with it. So LBJ said, hey, offer him, agricultural commissioner in Washington and all this stuff. And Celestes goes back to him and says, I've tried everything. Nothing will work. And supposedly, according to Celestes, LBJ says, get rid of him. So Henry Marshall shows up with a self-inflicted suicide wound done by a rifle into his own stomach. There are a number of things wrong with the case. And eventually, because of the information that gets brought forward here, it gets changed from suicide to homicide. But unfortunately, they don't know, there's no one to prosecute because it's 20 years later.
Isn't he shot more than once?
Shot 5 times in the stomach, yeah.
5 times.
And think about that. Like, oh, I'm trying
to remember.
There's a lot of self-loathing there, I guess.
Did he also have his hand mangled? Like he had been tortured?
That I don't remember, but I do remember that in the case of the railway guy who saw the shooting.
Okay.
Yeah, that was very interesting. What's interesting also is that the sketch of the person seen leaving the scene was this. And if you really take a look at it, you can see that one there. You've got, it's Mac Wallace, basically. And it's interesting, too, because he wore glasses, as we know. Now, there's a few things that this case is very important for. One, it's an unsolved homicide. Celestes went on the record and said it was Mac Wallace under the direction of LBJ who killed this agricultural official. But in some of the early articles about it, you'll read this very important fact, which is often left out. Quote, with rumblings about Billy Soul's apparently cozy relations with the agricultural department, officials becoming louder and louder, the administration resorted to time-tested public relations gimmick. Inside information leaked to the press that the Kennedys were actively trying to get to the bottom of the Estes case. On June 1st, the Dallas News reported in a copyrighted story that President Kennedy has taken a personal interest in the mysterious death of Henry Marshall. As a result, the story said, Bobby Kennedy has ordered the FBI to step up its investigation of the case. What went unreported was just how personal an interest the Kennedys took in the case. Rarely an evening passed during the 11 days the grand jury was in session over a 5-week period that Bobby Kennedy failed to telephone Judge Barron for details of the day's testimony. Sometimes he called twice. Barron told the Observer, I talked to John Kennedy one time and I talked to Bobby Kennedy, 10 or 12 times. Bobby, would just ask questions, how we were getting along, what he'd found, things like that. So LBJ, the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, scrawled on a May 21st memo, I just can't understand how one man can fire 5 shots at himself. So he, even LBJ, great friend there, J. Edgar Hoover, is not going along with this. So there's a lot of things that are very potent in that whole exchange. One, we have the very clear piece that the Kennedys are following this and thinking this guy is going to drop because he's involved in this murder case. 2, the fact that he blackmailed himself onto the ticket, maybe we can get him off. And that's a crucial thing. So that type of hostile relationship back and forth, and the fact that they're both looking for dirt on each other, gives you a real idea of what that relationship was like. And, when they get into the typical PBS special about LBJ and the Kennedys, they don't know, they never put anything on the record. Part of the problem is the historian over at PBS was sleeping with LBJ when she was trying to get details from him in the like 1971 or whatever, trying to get him on the record. She was his lover, for 8 months or something like that. How are you going to be impartial in any way, shape, or form, or talk about the terrible things that he did if you were, in love with this guy? So there's a lot of weird things when it comes to the media on this, but their protection of LBJ, I think, is remarkable as well. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. JFK assassination, aerospace, Antarctica, and the UFO file, all in one episode with Dram. Whoa. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of tonight's program, but we're giving really the setup for the conditions of the assassination, and then the factors that come into play from aerospace, from intelligence, and the main players politically, geopolitically, really going deep on this, so that by the time we're done tonight, between the 2 episodes, you're going to know the real outline of how that assassination was accomplished and what it was for. And as we lead up to the 60th anniversary of the JFK assassination coming up in November, a grim anniversary that it is, the fact that the government has still not released the records pertaining to the CIA's involvement in the crime show you the nature of the government that we're living under. And it's true that they could have pulled the old, this will embarrass the United States in the Cold War and all the rest of it. Problem is, the Cold War ended in 1991. So, the idea that 60 years later, any of this can be anything but protecting the insiders just doesn't add up. And they don't want to. One thing that's crucial, I think, when we go to understand their own mentality is anything that hits out at their authority and the authority of the deep state, or reveals the secrets of the deep state or the UFO file, or their record of assassination and assuming power through assassination, throws their entire program into peril. So much so that the deep state could be destroyed. So that gives us a better understanding about the UFO threat being run by the Central Intelligence Agency, one, and their reluctance to share any of the Kennedy records, even 60 years later, which would be beyond absurd in any other situation. We would call another government oppressive, totalitarian for doing such a thing. But in our country, you're just supposed to blow it off and be like, well, the CIA, it's a tough job. And I think part of the problem is the CIA, its role has grown and grown. They have their own Air Force. They control the media. They control entertainment. They're trying to control the UFO file. And they're so embedded in so many different layers that this is the danger that Kennedy saw with them. But Kennedy wasn't the only one. Over the years, we've seen other people. And then when you got someone who was more independent of that establishment, when Trump got into office, it was all hands on deck from the intelligence side to remove him from day one. And they continue on that piece. So, we get into a situation where the Central Intelligence Agency, instantly extra constitutional agency to start with, is in a position where they've amassed all this power, but it's not under a legal umbrella. So it's a completely illegal organization, but they've amassed all this power to themselves. And so if you are in that central power position in the White House and you want the control back under the executive branch, what do? Well, this is the great battle that took place in the Kennedy White House. And his own solutions were, I'm going to smash it into 1,000 pieces. That's where he was going. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, JFK Assassination, Aerospace, X Series 156. Your questions are coming up. I want to move, now that we've met some of these players, I want to move to the company that was at the heart of so much of this and the players involved. And that company is Ling Temco Vought. And then we're going to move into Byrd and Dram and how the assassination itself was performed. Ling Temco Vought is very important. It's an experimental aerospace company. So when Oswald shows up for work at the Texas School Book Depository, the owner of the building is a good friend of LBJ's, one. He's an oil billionaire, two. Three, he is the head of a experimental aerospace company. So that's the environment we're talking about. Byrd is very interesting for a number of reasons. As I said, he started the Civil Air Patrol, I think that for dual reasons, hidden reasons beyond why you would think ordinarily. His cousin is Admiral Byrd. The year 1963 for D.H. Byrd starts off very strangely. He goes to Antarctica himself. Now, his brother, of course, led the mighty expeditions there 5 times, including Operation High Jump, where he was chased out by flying discs. And he's supposed to be down there 6 months. They get chased out in 3 weeks, and he's freaked out. And he says to I actually have the quote tonight. He says to a Chilean journalist, we're going to have to do something because we're going to be chased. They can fly from pole to pole at amazing speeds, these discs, and we're going to have to realize that they're going to use the poles for war, and we're going to have to do something. And then when he gets back, he's buttoned up. 5 years later, he'll give an interview. He won't say anything about high jump, and then he dies 3 years later. But
can I ask you a question about that? So the only thing we know about high jump is from this interview with this Chilean journalist?
Well, the personnel involved, what happened, the official story about high jump is they go down there and they say, oh, hey, we accomplished all the things we needed to do in 3 weeks that we were supposed to do in 6 months, which doesn't make any sense. But as soon as he gets into Chile and he's talking with this reporter from El Mercurio, he lays it all out. He's like, we saw all these flying discs. And so, and he's like, we have to realize we're in a new situation and the war isn't between us and, these other countries anymore. It's these discs. So either he was suggesting there's some advanced group out of Antarctica. There's a lot of ways to read into what he was saying, but nonetheless, it's very strange. First of all, that he left, considering all the pride that he had in his Antarctica visits, and also the strange thing about flying discs. So it's right at the heart of the UFO question, but the UFO question comes directly into this as we go.
Okay, hold off. So TRM says, was there any corroboration of the Chilean story? What about anybody else who was on the expedition with him? Were they interviewed for their testimony also, or is it all just from him?
Well, no, as the leader of the expedition, he was the one who put things on the record. He gave the press conference and he talked directly to the journalist. That's all on the record. There's no dispute about him giving the interview. It's just the interpretation of what he said. The people that operated, remember that I'm going to get into this tonight, that Byrd was a Mason. And like Vannevar Bush before him with the UFO file, he knew Masonic secrecy techniques to keep secrets. And so the crews, because he had a near mutiny in one of his expeditions, and he decided, I am going to create this loyalist group. And so he created his own Masonic group inside of the expeditions. And one of the rules was nobody could ask who belonged to it. So if you were in it, you couldn't ask the other guy, hey, are you in this too? And what you find out also is that he started the first Masonic group in Antarctica, of course, and it is Lodge 777. Now, there's a thing about the 777. It goes into a lot of different areas. One of the things that 777 shows up as a magical formula. In Tesla's work, there's the law of 3 and the law of 7. In Gurdjieff's work, we've got the 7s showing up, the law of 3 and the law of 7. So there's a lot of crossover about this. Even in occult systems, you see this over and over again. I'm going to tell you something very weird. When I was preparing this, before I even got to 777, I myself was seeing 777 everywhere. And this is the weird thing about when we get into this in the X series, is these things open up directly in real time. I have no good explanation for why all those 7s were showing up, but then as soon as we got to Admiral Byrd, his lodge was 777. I guess that was some kind of a hint. What do you think?
I have a good question. Harriet K wants to know, can you speak of the bizarre death of Admiral Byrd's son?
Of course. Yeah, it's embedded in this episode.
Okay.
And we put it on the record, and he's an unusual case in himself, because he was going to give a speech about his dad's exploits in high jump in particular. The meeting was about high jump, and he was going to speak before a crowd in DC. So his disappearance and then showing up dead in different clothes, I think gives you some hint or idea that when he was going down there, people wondered, the people who grabbed him, the group that grabbed him, and they may have wondered what notes that he had, because there's always been the rumors that when Admiral Byrd died, he kept a diary of what actually happened in Antarctica, and that he kept it through secret family channels. And I'm convinced that they thought that he possessed this, which is why he became the target of it. What's interesting is he was seen, before he showed up dead, he was seen walking around in a dazed, drugged state for about 3 days. And when they found him finally, his clothes were all unusual. They weren't his normal clothes. So yeah, Byrd, there's a reason D.H. Byrd and Admiral Byrd are a huge crisscross in this episode, but let's keep going further with LTV, because this gets us to Byrd and experimental technology. In 1963, in November, Byrd, D.H. Byrd, the Texas oil man, owner of the Texas School Book Depository, and largest shareholder of LTV, he goes ahead and purchases 132 shares of Ling Temco Vought. Now, the company has recently been through some problems because there have been limits by the Defense Secretary McNamara about who gets contracts, et cetera. And the Kennedy administration has said to him, after he bought up a steel company and an airplane company and an aerospace company and was doing all these things, they basically were like, you're getting too big. We want to take a look at what you're doing. And it's funny because in his book, D.H. Byrd's book, which is a pseudo-biography, autobiography, but is certainly him giving some version of his history. He complains. He doesn't mention Kennedy by name, but he says, they're looking into us in 1961, and it wasn't fair. I was just a great free enterpriser, Here's a picture of D.H. Byrd surrounded by some of his trophies, and he was very happy to show off these trophies of, the animals that he killed in these various hunts. But he's heavy on showing off the trophies, and that's why after the assassination, it's quite fascinating. Here are a few interesting points to consider. The Texas School Book Depository and the 6th floor window are removed before he sells the building. And they're removed and they're placed in his living room, his banquet room. So that window becomes one of his trophies, in fact. So I think that gives us some hint of who we're dealing with here, that he likes to take the trophy after the act, as it were. And for you animal lovers out there, I'm sorry to show these pictures of him on the hunt, but this is very much to the core, and we're coming up with one here.
Can I make a point?
Yeah.
And I'm just saying, JFK's brain is missing, right? It's never been found.
That's really true. That's really true. Yeah. A very, very strange point, in fact. Can you imagine, what kind of a world are we living in where the president's brain can disappear?
Satanic.
So here we have a picture of Byrd on the hunt there, but that person with them is very interesting. That's Jim Doolittle, lifelong friend. We're going to find that Doolittle becomes crucial when looking around at this, but that's another one of Byrd's trophies, as it were. I also want to point this out, which is, although he puts himself out there as this famous safari hunter, et cetera, in fact, he didn't really adopt this practice until after the assassination. Now, this is very interesting and important because he'd traveled the world, yes, but he'd never gone on African safaris and things like that. That comes through his association with Dram. And Dram, of course, leads Safarilandia in Mozambique and is doing all of these hunting pieces. And that's the excuse that he will use to bring Dram over here early in 1963, and Dram stays. He's here for 6 or 7 months, and then he leaves together with Byrd. I have a number of articles of Dram talking to the press with his wife and being kind of the belle of the ball. And nowhere in there is anything about his Nazi past or anything like that. So it's very interesting the way that they positioned us, and also to be out of town, as it were, when the actual incident happens, after you can see that they had all this time to set it all up. Another thing that is important to keep in mind about the Texas School Book Depository is that the building is empty before the Texas School Book Depository leases it. It's empty for a while. So there's a lot of ways and means to set things up in advance, say if they know it's going to be used that way. And then when the Texas School Book Depository moves in, the owner says, well, we're still working on that 6th floor. We have these workmen going in and out. Don't pay any attention to them. So the presence of unknown people going in and out of the Texas School Book Depository, working on floors and things like that, is part of the setup of the day when Oswald is in there pushing books for $1.25 an hour. And of course, when we look at the system of how this operates, D.H. Byrd setting up the Civil Air Patrol and Lee Harvey Oswald being a part of the Civil Air Patrol, and they have him visiting the various CAPs throughout Texas and New Orleans and all the rest of it. It is Ferry, David Ferry, who is leading up the New Orleans branch of the Civil Air Patrol that Oswald joins. And so the idea of him visiting with Ferry and Ferry saying, well, I've gone through all these different recruits. This is the guy that we can use. Let's groom him over time to work with these intelligence things, and then we'll build him to do these various missions for us. Makes a lot of sense. And, there's a complete track record of Oswald with Ferry. And it's very interesting because, there's a number of books that try to support the official story of the Warren Commission, which, the lone gunman and all that stuff. And whenever Ferry came up, because there was so much evidence around Ferry and Oswald, what they said was, oh, he wasn't even there. He wasn't even at the Central Civil Air Patrol at the same time, so he couldn't have known him. And then the picture came out, and it blew away all those books and documentaries with all that junk that was debunking Ferry. And it was a picture of Ferry coaching Oswald at the, during one of the Civil Air Patrol meetings. It's unmistakable. They're there in the picture together. He's the unit commander, game over. But those people are still out there. They still hang out, and so I think in order to get to the truth around these things, what they do is they keep you in the stasis thing of these little fencing matches about it, and none of that matters at all. The point now is to move on from the evidence that's on the ground with already the knowledge that the CIA is involved and the paperclip forces are involved. That's crucial. Everyone, you're here with us watching DRAM, JFK Assassination Aerospace, Antarctica, and the UFO File, going deep tonight. We'll be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. And before we go any further, I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, especially if you're new here. Sign up for our newsletter. It keeps us in touch through all these fantastic censorship campaigns that are going on. And boy, are we really in the middle of them. And it feels like as we go into 2024, we are just getting hit with that, because I think that they want to clamp down any dissent on the Biden regime. Of course, it's not going to happen. Now, before I go any further, Miss Olivia Europe.
David Tremaine, DJ, who do you suspect was the original inspirational force pushing for the JFK assassination? The American deep state, or perhaps the Nazis?
Well, that portion of the post-Nazi international, right, that they go into the space program. So they've kept their secret information. They've kept the secret designs, the HARP technology, and the Bell and all the rest of it. And what's happened is, by the time they embed themselves in NASA, there's kind of a thing going on there where they haven't given NASA all that they have. And so I think that they're playing a game here, but they're starting to build into this space organization with NASA. And so therefore, that element inside of the intelligence community dealing with space. That's the X-Protect group. The aerospace wing in between the intelligence wing, it's that group that ends up being responsible for the Kennedy assassination. And I think that the pushback is when Kennedy is threatening to smash the CIA, he's threatening to go in after that group because their whole cover, as it were, is the CIA. It's the CIA that has propped up the paperclip aspect, and they've protected it as well. So if you smash the Central Intelligence Agency, you get to their advanced technology. Oh, and by the way, he wants to share the UFO file, Kennedy, with the Russians, their hated enemy. They don't want to do anything but eliminate the Soviet Union because, after all, they just killed 25 million Russians during World War II. So their feelings haven't changed any. So that's where the root of it is. Now, there are financial institutions and the whole Bilderberg kind of aspect around eliminating Kennedy. There's no question about it. But it is the intelligence groups that have the urgency, and the urgency is around aerospace. So that's one of those things. I think that if we start from aerospace and work our way through, we get better. I was talking last week about how we have a lot of these very good researchers who just only make one mistake about the order of things. And so they'll do something like they'll put the intel structures down here being like in the mafia up here. And it doesn't work like that. It's the inverse. It is the intelligence agencies using things like organized crime. And then the intelligence agencies are not the regular government apparatus. We have to think of them like, they're born out of this connection to international finance through New York law firms. It's different. It's not like General so-and-so coming in here. Remember, the first leader of the Central Intelligence Agency was a general. They had that military connection to things. What happens is the setup for the CIA, it becomes the puppet of this international finance wing. It represents them. So there's a good example of this, which is, say you're an oil company like Exxon and you want to put oil fields in Uzbekistan. And, you move into this position where you want to do that, but you're afraid with the leadership there that there could be some kind of a coup or something. Then you lose all your oil fields, all this investment or whatever. So you send in the CIA there to suss out the situation, throw that guy out, and put in a really hardcore, hardline guy who won't get overthrown in a coup. And they'll use this system through, I could sit here all night from Guatemala to Iran and all these other ones to show you how the CIA has used that system. And that's how they do it. And it's interesting. It doesn't have anything to do necessarily with the objectives of the United States, but it has something to do with the objectives of corporate America and, those international corporations, the global control of those corporations. That's how it's been used. And I think that there was an American-centric ideal with a lot of this when it started. And they were able to brainwash people with the idea that we're fighting, this incredible existential threat of communism. But once communism fell, that whole apparatus was supposed to change. We were supposed to have a peace dividend and all the rest of it. Instead, we got terrorism, right? And then when you go through terrorism, then you have, financial collapse. And then, what's next? Well, then your own citizens are against you. MAGA's the enemy. But ultimately the UFO threat, that's the thing that gives them the most power. You can see this trajectory, but just understanding, if we want to get to what the Central Intelligence Agency is, it's not like we understand it as a functional role of the government. It is a thing that has been co-opted. It's illegal to start with, but then it was co-opted by this connection, this international finance connection. That's where you get the deep state operating. But the problem is the CIA, like they have in Ukraine, representing those interests, puts us in perilous situations, and then our military gets drawn in as a result of that. So this is how the setup goes. And then the president can come forward and say, well, This is why the situation in Ukraine is so crucial, by the way. But he can come forward and say, oh, we had some planes bombed in Poland, and now we have to go in. Now we need troops on the ground in Ukraine. What are we going to do when they say that? It becomes a crucial question. And we have to, all of us, think about that. Here we are talking about the history of it. But in 1963, they faced the exact same questions. And Kennedy's response was, I'm actually going to pull everyone out of Vietnam. And, that's anathema to those people who wanted Cuba to start with. Now you're going to take away all of this other apparatus that has yet to be realized. So Kennedy is challenging on a number of levels, and he wants to build freedom together with the world. And the forces inside our deep state post World War II, and in some aspects pre-World War II, want to impose a certain type of program on the rest of the world. That's very different. So let's keep that in mind as we get through Kennedy. Understanding the reasons why becomes very important. Okay. Here's an interesting piece. This is about LTV, written by Peter Dale Scott. And he mentions a very interesting person, Jack Crichton, here, which I think is crucial. Professor Peter Dale Scott, a fellow director of Crichton's firm, Dorchester Gas, was D.H. Byrd, who was an oil associate of Sid Richardson and Clint Murchison. Clint Murchison was basically like the Bill Gates of oil. He was the oil billionaire, the top. D.H. Byrd was the LTV director who teamed up with James Ling to buy 132 shares of LTV in November 1963 while waiting to be sworn in as president in Dallas on November 22nd. Johnson spoke by telephone with J.W. Bullion, a member of the Dallas law firm Thompson, Wright and Knight, which had the legal account for Dorchester Gas and was represented on its board. The senior partner of the firm, Dwight Simmons, had until 1960 sat on the board of Chance Vote Aircraft, a predecessor to Ling Temco Vote. They all merged. 1 week after the assassination, Johnson named Bullion, who had been described as his business friend and lawyer, to be one of the first two trustees handling the affairs of the former LBJ company while its owner was president. Now, this is very interesting because the crossover with Johnson and LTV goes even further. What happens is those LTV shares go from $2.3 million that he invests for 132,000 of them to $50 million by 1965, just a few short years later. It's an incredible expanse from a company that really wasn't doing very well. And this is Byrd's company. When he comes back from that safari with Dram, he's got his good friend as the president, one. Two, his building is famous, but none of the stories of the time mention anything about him at all. They all talk about Roy Truly, the manager of the building, or whatever. In fact, I found the New York Times obituary of D.H. Byrd, and it doesn't mention that he owns the Texas School Book Depository. In his entire biography, I'm an Endangered Species, you won't find any mention of the Texas School Book Depository. So he left it out of his official bio, as it were. And I think that's extremely telling, considering the crimes that he participated in related to it. So this gets us into very, very interesting territory now, because we're starting to see, he's profited all this money. Well, here's another weird thing. LBJ immediately, one of his first acts as president, is to award a contract for all these, Ling Temco Vout experimental planes, helicopters, electronic surveillance equipment, everything, aerospace. And he orders it all with the 1965 budget, which hasn't been approved by Congress yet. So he's just saying, your money's set. And that stock goes through the roof. So if you can just consider on a purely practical level, sometimes we talk about this in relation to 9/11. There's a lot of people who track stock activities with airlines from 9/11 and the incredible hit that many of those airlines took, and people betting on them going down, etc. But all the things that you would suspect were going to do well in an attack like that, there's incredible movements of stock going on, that these deep events, kind of ensure all these people are going to get paid off dramatically in the market by knowing about this beforehand. Well, LTV is a perfect early example of the same system operating because, that November, just before the assassination, before Byrd goes off to Mozambique with Dram, the Nazi assassin, uh, he gets 132 shares of LTV. And that will be really his incredible, financial expanse. Because when you think about the kind of money that he had, he was wealthy, certainly before. He married into money right off the bat. But what I see really when we're looking at Byrd is that LTV is his payoff for being in the center of things. And he's pleased as punch to have his old friend LBJ in the White House when he gets back. There's another thing I want to point out too. We get into Byrd, which is that he seems to be operating with the CAP, independent military, that is civilian military. And this gets us into his friend and associate, Jack Crichton, who will play a role in the JFK assassination, in that he's the one who, even though he's in, oil, petroleum business and all the rest of it, he shows up as the person getting Marina Oswald a translator after Oswald is accused of assassinating the president. And guess what he has? He has his own intelligence unit called the 488th Unit, but they're all civilian. And there's nothing military about them at all. But this civilian unit is very much like the Civil Air Patrol. Somehow they are creating another layer, a civilian layer of government activities, because they have the kind of money to do this. But interestingly enough, you're going to find that most of the Dallas police force is on that 488th intelligence group that Crichton puts together. Let's spend a little time on Crichton, and then we're going to go right into the heart of Admiral Byrd and his association with Byrd and how that crisscross works. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep tonight on DRAM, the JFK assassination, aerospace, Antarctica, and the UFO file. We're going to take your questions here in about a half hour, I would say, or no, a little less, maybe like 20 minutes. And you can ask those questions now before I go any further. Miss Olivia.
David Termina, DJ, if Alan Dulles was intimately involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler called Project Valkyrie, this directly links Dulles to Byrd through von Alvensleben. Am I getting this straight?
There are some interesting things that Dulles is associated with that would appear to give him the appearance of being anti-Nazi, but he becomes the one who is completely trying to give the Nazis a soft landing for losing. And he starts that activity of negotiating their surrender in 1943. If anything, it seems to me that he's more on their side. And remember too that there's a crisscross here with Alvensleben, which is that although he works with the Nazis for that whole decade, he switches out at a certain point and becomes an OSS double agent against the Nazis. So, what we call the Nazis at that point of defeat might be switching over and becoming this kind of mass of the people who are left over, from the old structure, moving into the new structure. So the Argentina version of the Nazi party getting, wings, while the old version and the Hitler version with all its baggage, that's going down, and Dulles is making the deals for the others. Because there's a tremendous story of Nazis escaping from Nazi Germany, all the rat line stuff and how they did it, through the Vatican and all the rest of it. And you have these guys, all these Nazis dying 5 different times. It becomes an unusual story once we get to the judgment at Nuremberg that Walter Dernberger is going to be held for crimes against humanity. And he's close to being hanged. And it is only through Werner von Braun that he gets saved. So Paperclip is really in earnest. The space program that they had coming out of Russia into ours is saved when von Braun intercedes on behalf of his old boss. And in fact, he says, I can't do it without him. So that's pretty interesting because Dornberger, of course, becomes the person who is the tutor of and the sponsor of Michael Paine, and Oswald is staying at the Paines. So we have a direct link right out of Paperclip directly into the assassination. There's no question about it. And the people who've put that on the record over the years, like Mae Brussel, Jim Marrs, and others, they were way ahead of their time, because a lot of people would say at the time, what do you mean Nazis? What are you talking about? The Nazis lost in World War II. They didn't get the nuance of the fact that this group, with its incredible power and treasure and scientific discoveries, still existed. They just didn't have Germany as their home. And they embedded themselves in other places. Don't tell me that the Nazis and the Third Reich, as they were, didn't have contingency plans. For sure that they did. And, we find that dramatically in the work of Dr. Farrell. No question about it. But it's an excellent point and a great question. I'm going to backtrack here for a moment to get back to the court case momentarily. All right. So the Dram aspect, Werner von Alvensleben. Dram was a Nazi assassin, and he worked for Himmler. And he obviously, by joining the OSS, ran afoul of the Nazis at some point. Or did he? But the idea of his CIA activity is the point of the court case. They're trying to find out, what was he doing for the CIA? Because when he shows up at the Texas School Book Depository, that long CIA record may come into play. So here's the name of the case, as I showed last week: Opposition to Motion for Summary Affirmance, as filed. So it's August 17th, 2023. It's USCA case 235064. And this is the thrust of it. Quote, it's from the AARC. They're the ones who are bringing the case. AARC does not espouse or support a particular theory about the assassination of President Kennedy. Appellant James Lessar is a private citizen and attorney and founder of the AARC. Lessar has devoted decades of study and research to the circumstances of the assassination. FOIA request seeks records related to the owner of the Texas School Book Depository, David Harold Byrd, D.H. Byrd, also known as Dry Hole Byrd, Byrd's African safari hunting host and guest visitor to Dallas in late 1963, Werner von Alvensleben, who, according to released CIA predecessor organization documents, OSS records, has served as an assassin for Nazi leader Heinrich Himmler in Germany in 1933. This is the thing that's surfacing here in the middle of all this that's so crucial, which is his background as an assassin. Yes, he's a guest of Byrd, and that's suspicious as hell already. But again, it's the fact that he has this history of being an organizer. He's a master assassin, in fact. That's the crucial aspect here. President Kennedy was said to have been hit by bullets fired from the Texas School Book Depository building. At the time of the assassination, D.H. Byrd owned that building. He was a cousin of U.S. Senator Harry Byrd and his brother, U.S. Navy Admiral Richard E. Byrd. And he goes into it, and there's a lot of details related to that. And there's a lot of series material in the court case. I want to point that out. I wouldn't be surprised this guy had been watching and rolled these things into his court case, but it's a fantastic thing. Now, they make an interesting note here, though, which has to do with the fact that they're looking for information about his service to the U.S. as a double agent. And this convicted assassin came from a family which his father was reported to U.S. intelligence to be a specialist in political assassinations after World War I in Germany. Now, the father had the same name. He's Alvensleben Sr., and there's a weird history with him because originally this family is connected all the way back. You can find them in documents from 1100 in Germany as one of the ruling families. So you have this history, and then if you go further into it, you're going to find the presence of things like the Teutonic Knights, etc. So that part, we're going to open up some of the kind of genie in the bottle around that. But for now, let's just say this is not a casual person to show up on the scene with Byrd. He is a Nazi assassin, and he's been switched over to OSS as double agent, becomes part of the CIA, and is associated with this huge Alvensleben line in history that goes all the way back to the Teutonic Knights. So that is just for the record, Assassination Archives and Research Center. That is the case that we're discussing when we get around Dram. And I'm glad that this has opened it up, because there's so much about Byrd that we've put on the record, that is our friend D.H. Byrd, that this piece is going to connect up multiple elements. And then we have Antarctica sitting there, hanging out in the middle of it. In fact, as we know, and we reported on a number of shows dealing with the International Geophysical Year, that we have that big show on that coming up. But it is, in fact, interesting that the person who headed up the Robertson UFO panel, Lloyd Berkner, major presence in a number of unusual things, including the fact that he had been in Antarctica with Byrd in 1929, and that he set up the first radio station in Little America and things like this, that Berkner is the person that Kennedy is going to meet at the Trade Mart. And for some reason, this is something we put on the record. I don't know how it got missed in all the mass of JFK information, but this is a crucial piece of it. Lloyd Berkner sitting back there, working with the Robertson panel on the UFO side, working with Byrd in Antarctica, and then showing up in the middle of the JFK assassination as the person that he's going to meet. And there's a weird thing there in his own notes saying that Kennedy's going to make an announcement that is going to stagger everything internationally. That's one. Two, the Kennedy notes are that they have a whole ceremony planned where a helicopter is going to land and bring out a flag that's been flown over the White House, and it's going to hand it to Berkner. So whatever they're going to announce there. Now, there's a number of things it could have been. It could have been ceremonial, yes. But it seems like from the notes that something major was going to come out. So was Kennedy going to say, we're going jointly to the moon with the Russians? I mean, it may just come down to that. Or was he going to say, we're sharing UFO files? We don't know. But it is important to note that Berkner's associated with both UFOs and Antarctica. That meeting and that aspect of what we're talking about, I think, brings us into very close to what's going on there with the switch of government, because the way that they do the assassination is very much like the coups that they performed in other countries. And what you needed to do, and in this case they did it, is they flew the cabinet out of the country and had them heading to Japan. And they landed intermediate stop in Hawaii, and they were heading on to Japan. And then the call came over, the president's been assassinated. The plane turns around, and it's weird because if you read the newspapers in Japan the next day, it says, oh, this and this official came here. They said blah, blah, blah. The articles were already ready, but they never made it. They all came back because of the assassination. This is the type of activity. This is the staged coup that took place, because you could not have all the officials in there. They couldn't have blood on their hands, as it were. So when you get a few years down the road to RFK running for president, then you run the risk of undoing this massive chance that the deep state took to perform the coup d'etat in the first place. So naturally, he has to be eliminated. But LBJ decides, I'm not going to run. Forget it. I'm out. He decides that he's not going to run because he knows if RFK is running, they're going to assassinate him. And he can't be there standing as the recipient of two major political assassinations. So he's out of there. That's unusual too. It's never happened before that a president says, you know what, I'm not going to run. They all run, you know.
Look, Nancy Pelosi still won't give up at 83. Ridiculous.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you're a president and you have the presidency, you're going to run. This is what makes the 1968 piece so unusual. And yet, the presence of RFK Jr. in this race for 2024 brings us directly back to this line. And you could call it the flag of Camelot. You know, it is, all of that is in play because where Kennedy is taking the country in 1963 is vastly different than the plans that the deep state have for it. And it's their plans that have stood, and yet there have been these interruptions along the way. And 2024 stands to be a massive interruption for sure. All right. What else you got?
You caught me at a bad moment.
There's no such thing as a bad moment when you're doing a live stream. Come on. Okay. A little bit about COG here in relation to Jack Crichton, which is where we left off. First of all, Crichton is mentioned as somebody who's a close associate of D.H. Byrd, and he's the president of NAFCO Oil, but he does a hell of a lot besides that. He runs his own intelligence network. They're deep in the heart of Texas. And it's interesting because this is a shot of our friend Crichton, early newspaper article there. Crichton was appointed head of the intelligence component of Dallas Civil Defense. The conservative radio commentator Paul Harvey wrote in a syndicated column September 1960, the communists since 1917 have sold communism to more people than have been told about Christ after 2,000 years. He urged his readers to support the counterattack that had been mounted in Dallas. In 1961, Crichton joined forces with other right-wing figures in Dallas to establish a program called Know Your Enemy. This was to combat communist influence that was undermining the American way of life. The following year, Crichton opened an underground command post under the patio of the Dallas Health and Science Museum that was intended for, quote, continuity of government operations during a communist attack. He's using a COG bunker to create his Dallas Civil Defense. So right away, when you get around the JFK assassination, you've got COG figures involved. One of them is a Secret Service agent I've talked about before, Winston Lawson. And Winston Lawson uses the Doomsday Network when he's setting up the route. There's never any explanation for it. Secret Service don't do that. But there he was using the COG Doomsday Communication Network. So by using that secret network, none of what he said is picked up or recorded or anything like that. And it's interesting because there are other COG personnel around the White House who were involved in setting up the trip as well. But Lawson becomes particularly interesting because he lies during his Warren Commission testimony. And that's what has made people take a second look at him anyway as a Secret Service agent. But then again, whenever you get around a deep event, it seems like the COG personnel are very close by. John Dean, who was COG personnel just before he became Nixon's lawyer, he's the one who turns evidence and basically sells out Nixon. Oliver North is involved directly in Iran-Contra. He set up COG in the 80s, Rex 84 and programs like this. So when you get to 2001 and they operate continuity of government program, you've got Rumsfeld and Cheney, who as private citizens were working on COG. So COG is a factor in American national security apparatus like the UFO file, which is largely ignored by any kind of real political analysis. So we don't even know it's there enough to talk about it, debate it, or find out how much money it's gobbling up, whatever it happens to be. The COG operates completely on its own level. This individual, Crichton, who is tight with Byrd and, is involved in, for example, something as straight up as getting the Russian interpreter for Marina Oswald so that she'll say the right, be the right type of interpretation to convict Oswald in the eyes of the public. That's crucial. These personnel are working. And then there he is directly operating this continuity of government operations bunker in 61. In 1963, Crichton was nominated by the Republican Party for the post of governor of Texas. He joined forces with George H.W. Bush, who was the nominee for U.S. Senate. As Crichton later recalled, he and Bush spoke from the same podiums that year. So Bush moving his way into, those centers of power through Prescott Bush, and Prescott Bush, major connections to the whole paperclip program. And if you go back even further with Prescott, you're going to find him getting busted for trading with the enemy. And, the Union Bank that he's the president of, FDR shuts down and says, you're cashing Nazi bonds. Like, what's going on over there? So you have this heavy over-influence left over of the Nazi regime. And it hasn't gone anywhere. It's no longer headquartered in Germany for world domination. It's moved into its various areas, financially, technologically, and otherwise. Space, and it's found its way through other countries, and in this case, America. So let's keep that in mind a little more on this track. I'm trying to find someone here. Let's see. Where did I put him? Okay, yeah, this is important. And think about Alvin Schleben kind of in a paperclip sense, because we converted him over. Those are the paperclip scientists. And it is important that we can remember that part of that program were these two guys who worked very closely together. That's von Braun there, and that's Dornberger. Remember this about Dornberger. Dornberger becomes the person who, as I said, he's the mentor to Michael Paine. Michael Paine is the husband of Ruth Paine. The Oswalds are staying with Michael Paine. Dornberger, Oswald, Paine, von Braun. Those connections, if you were like a prosecuting attorney, you couldn't miss them. You'd have, you'd find those connections and say, how are they related to the crime? Because it's too close for comfort. So this idea of Oswald as this random, wacky communist, and who gets a lucky shot doesn't add up at all. He had a terrible life working for $1.25 an hour. That's why he wanted to get back at Kennedy. I mean, Kennedy was good, I think, to poor people. So that doesn't make any sense either. A lot of the storytelling aspects inside of the intelligence agencies are crucial, because that's how they've converted other countries. And what they had was a program in place to sweep places like Italy, and get rid of communist influence by propagandizing them. In this case, they turned that process around and propagandized people in the United States. And when we get directly to DRAM, here we have inside the United States someone who's a master assassin at the age of 51. It's very vital still, working directly with Byrd and showing him everything basically that he can do on that front. So when we're looking at that, we have to say that Byrd's association with DRAM and the fact that this is the center of a court case opens up a whole entire chapter around the Kennedy assassination, because the people who spoke of the fascist involvement now have a focal point. And we've had all these pieces related to it. But DRAM shows up very mysteriously in all of this, as I said, because for one, his father was also known as a master assassin. One of the weird things that happens on the trip that Dram takes with D.H. Byrd to Mozambique just before the assassination. I think that's part of the records that they're trying to get. Exactly when did he leave? Because we know it was late November, but supposedly it was just before the assassination. So there's a relative of Dram who I'm trying to figure out if it's his son or nephew. I'm getting close. I think it's his son, but he's a really high-end photographer. And so he goes around making these shots of the various hunts that Alvin Schliemann did. And here he has this picture, and it says shot by Harold Byrd, December 7th, 1963. But on the bottom, there's a really interesting entry. It said, Colonel Byrd's trophy picture. And then it says, quote, the question is, an alibi? That is, are you just pretending that you were there? It's a weird thing for the relative to put online on the record. I mean, it's a little bit unusual. That is supposedly the arrival of Colonel Byrd on his hunting expedition. On the days to come, J.F. Kennedy will be shot from his building in Dallas, Texas. But there he is. He's all ready to hunt up some fresh jungle and being taught by a Nazi to do it. So what was Alvin Schliemann doing with Byrd in that period of 6 months that he was staying there? It's very unusual. And that he leaves right before the assassination, it's really enough to warrant opening the entire case up again, in my opinion, with this in mind. But we're not done with Byrd yet. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. I'll tell you what we're going to do, because we have so much to get through. So I'm going to start taking questions now, and I'm going to weave in what we have here. And of course, we're going to do another episode on all of this to bring it all together further, because I have a huge Antarctica section here that we're going to get to, but we're going to mix it in with your questions. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
I'm going to start with a comment from Lou Weed, who says, the more I hear about these space Nazis, the less I like them.
Space Nazis, yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of the space thing came from the Nazis. Let's not forget. We had a great rocket, program here, but the Nazis were far, far ahead of us, and they were more obsessed with the whole control of the globe from a space grid from above. That's their whole thing. Their whole Space Corps idea was to control what was on the ground from above. So when we get into satellites and things that control our world now, and it's an amazing thing, because RFK Jr. got into trouble during the summer when he made this analogy, and he said something that was absolutely true. He said that, in the days of the Nazis, Anne Frank, and her uncle, they ran, they hid, they went to buildings. But now with the way that the surveillance is set up, you can't even do that. And a Holocaust survivor actually came forward and agreed with him on that. But all these newspapers, came forward and said, oh, he's unfit for command. Look what he said. He mentioned the Holocaust, No, it's important to understand that the Nazis, for everything that they did not possess the technology that we have today. So that technology in the wrong hands, there's just no doubt about it. It would be, their dream, their ultimate fantasy to have anything close to the technology that we have. As a matter of fact, a big story came out today, and it was broken by Alex Jones. And it was really interesting, because he nailed it, though, because, the sources on it were 100% solid. And what he said was that the ADL, which, has been doing all these things recently against Twitter. But what was found and what came out was that the ADL have a number of bots that they're plugging in through the social media companies. And those bots are designed to listen to you the way that Siri and what is the Amazon one again? Our friends there. There's a number
Alexa.
of these. Alexa, yes. And so they listen to you, but now the ADL has their own special version that's listening to you. And so they got caught out on it. And the response basically was, yeah, well, we are doing that, but we're not sharing it. We're just listening to it for research and development. So, they're creating a social credit score based on what you say privately in their own interpretation. And they're listening into you based on little bots that they plug into social media. I mean, come on, if that's not a Nazi Gestapo's type tactic, these things have gone too far. We've reached that breaking point with so many of them. Too many of the organizations are captured. Too much of the corporations are self-serving. Too much of the political apparatus is corrupt. And there's a breaking point where the system has become too top heavy and too much power is concentrated there. And so they're setting up their own conditions for a dramatic global revolution. And what they're trying to do, in my opinion, is create their phony like World Economic Forum revolution before that happens, to stave that off, as it were, and pretending that they're more powerful and they can do this, when in fact, if you put the weight of, close to 8 billion people against their technology and, the lattes and the stuff that flow at Davos, and I like lattes too, but you really get into it and you realize somebody's feeding them, this weird kind of ego fantasy trip that they're on. That's why you see, even with all their billions of dollars, the real fear in their eye when their operations don't work. And I've pointed out over and over again on this program that the key one of the good things to defang before it becomes full bore is the UFO threat. Go for it.
Okay, Scarlet Fire says, don't kid yourself. The entire planet has been captured by the cabal and control all major corporations, governments, and anything of value. Hugo Fugyaselv says, Fletcher Prouty described the CIA's secret team. They infiltrated every office of government they could with secret CIA operatives, sidestepped all bureaucracy, and had inside access to everything. Rogue agency. Amarillo Gunrunner says, which presidents were the CIA afraid of, if any?
Well, they got afraid. Their main problem was Kennedy, although it's interesting because they have to toe the line a lot and get around Eisenhower, because Eisenhower, being centered and from the military, knows exactly what they're up to. And Kennedy is the one who is saying, let's bring that control back under the executive branch. The war powers, UFO file, the whole thing is coming back to the presidency. This is why they despise him. And this is also why he's in the I'm going to smash them into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. That's a real standoff. And the standoff ends when they put their apparatus in motion, because they're fantastic at assassination, right? This is their business after all. And then the cover up after the fact, there are problems with it, because although it works through the media and stuff, people don't believe it. And so you have, since the 1960s, that entire, the impetus for the independent media comes directly out of the JFK assassination. There's no question about it. But yeah, it gets us into very interesting territory. I would say that, there are a number of things that are captured, but they're on thin ice, a lot of them. And when they overreach, like the California bill that I mentioned about absconding with people's children if they don't affirm their agenda, that is, those lines will be, you'll have dramatic face-off, and that's a kind of a worldwide thing. When it comes to America in the election in 2024, you're looking at a gigantic face-off, because they're going to try to, through legal means, deny the candidate access. If Bobby runs independently after being disillusioned now with the Democratic side, then this also gets us into interesting territory. The other thing I want to say about Fletcher Prouty, Mr. X, is that he said, after all the different threats that we set up, about through the Cold War, that they were now prepping, and this is 1997, he said it, that they were prepping the UFO threat, that this is what they're going for. So that's him, chief spook for many years, deep inside, was the liaison between CIA and the Joint Chiefs, he knew very well. And he got out. And he also has an Antarctica connection, which is they sent him to Antarctica so he wouldn't set up security for the president's trip to Dallas, which would have ordinarily been his job. And when he comes back, he notices, weird pictures of Ed Lansdale wandering around Dealey Plaza. And then it starts to dawn on him, oh, we've had a coup. If you look at 1963, I'm going to show you, when we look at this as a graph on the CIA side, they were overthrowing everything and everybody. And this is the problem, which is they gained too much of a foothold in that period. But, the assassinations of the Diem brothers in Vietnam, that's all CIA work, using the crowd, that they got rid of this very open-minded UN Secretary General, and brought him down in a plane crash. Then that's investigated, and it turns out it was all monkey business. He was killed. And what they weren't able to do, but that almost happened, is they tried to throw out de Gaulle in France through a coup, and it didn't work. And instead, the people from the coup got in trouble. And in Kennedy's conversation with de Gaulle over it, he said, when they asked him, was your CIA involved? He says, they're operating so independently, I can't tell you definitively that they weren't. He knew that they were. And so he's already aware of what they're doing. So you have this force out there, and, how do you do it without going before the public and saying the Central Intelligence Agency is out of control and we have to fight them? I mean, Kennedy was working in so many different lines, trying to strip their power by giving it back to the Joint Chiefs. And so this is the nature of that fight. So the other presidents, I would say, who had problems with the CIA, Carter is definitely among them. As a matter of fact, he installs a friend of his who's an admiral as a CIA director, and they just don't listen to him. They treat him as an outsider. And the CIA was smart enough and had enough worldwide connections to offshore their black budget projects during the Carter presidency, because of so many Kennedy investigations going on showing basically that they killed President Kennedy. So how do you continue as an organization? Well, they offshored it, and then it comes back when Reagan gets in the White House. They say to Reagan, oh, the Sandinistas are inviting the Soviets in, and they reboost the whole thing. And then the former director of the CIA is his VP, and he runs all that behind the scenes. We don't know how much he's telling Reagan, in fact. So that's how the CIA gets their whole groove back, and they just have, somersaulted ever since then. What's interesting to me is if you really look at their efforts of late, there's two things that stand out. There's Ukraine and there's the UFO threat. So the position that they're moving into, think of how dangerous, how they're doubling things down at this, 75, 76 years now since their creation. Their consolidation power is on the move, but really it's the entire deep state apparatus, so the entire intelligence community. But the CIA is the pinnacle head of that group. Yes.
Fooper Fighter, didn't Dulles and McCloy also trade with the enemy? And Michael X says Skull and Bones made the CIA.
Yeah. Well, McCloy is really interesting. There's a lot of weird things. He interviewed and met with, a lot of these guys have met Hitler. I find that weird too. Dulles met Hitler. Richard Helms, CIA met Hitler. John J. McCloy interviewed Hitler. I mean, that's a lot of meeting Hitler if you are intelligence agencies. I don't know. But they were, this is the 1936 Olympics, when supposedly Hitler wasn't such a bad guy, right? They were hosting the Olympics. So they have kind of a cover on it, but I think it's pretty interesting. Definitely. A couple of quick things. So in some of the setup here, we have the setup for the assassination involves the building and the strange route taken. So Kennedy would be a sitting duck when he's assassinated in Dealey Plaza. the person who set up the route, as I mentioned, was Winston Lawson, who was associated with the Continuity of Government program and using the White House Emergency Doomsday Network for setting up the route. Earl Cabell is the mayor of Dallas. So we have an interesting crisscross here. What they find out later through JFK records release first is that he's a CIA asset. What we know is that his brother is the CIA deputy chief that Kennedy fires. So that's the person who is leading Kennedy around and sets up that weird motorcade route. So therefore, the CIA basically sets up the motorcade route. So the unusual ambush that the president drives into is accommodated by the brother of the person that Kennedy had fired. Now, Cabell is also interesting for a few reasons, because as a CIA asset and the mayor of Dallas, he has a lot, again, of pull. And when we get directly into Dealey Plaza, what you need there is local control to control. The federal control is the original plot of the CIA, but then you need control of the police, things on the ground. You need the ability to give the corpse away before you do an autopsy, all these different things that needed to be done locally. So you have to have that dialed in. I'm going to go back to Dram for a minute. So Dram shows up with the most unusual people, famous actors. Stavros, and I have a whole piece about this, but he's basically, this another version of Onassis. But this one really struck me because, there's that big hunting room that I showed that he has in Mozambique, and that Dram has. This picture is astronaut Wally Schirra at that very same camp, and he is going to do a big safari with our friend Dram. That's why he's there. And he's in Dram's book. I got Dram's book on all those safaris and all the rest of it. And you say to yourself, how does this work? How do you get one of the original, Gemini astronaut guys hanging out with Dram?
What's your answer?
I think this shows, again, the crisscross of aerospace into the assassination, because if you have someone deeply involved in the assassination like Dram, and then you have the astronauts hanging out with him, then it's showing that he has NASA pull. And so these guys are going to Mozambique to hunt with this ex-Nazi. It gets us into strange territory, but let's get even stranger. Are you ready? Mm-hmm. Actually, I should let you ask a question at this point.
Just want to throw this out there. Don Neway said Killian helped create NASA, 1958, served as a member of the President's Science Advisory Committee until 61, then worked as chairman of the Carnegie Commission on Educational Television, 65 to 67. Wow. Lyndon B. Johnson's top space advisor goes to control public broadcasting. To me, that says a lot.
Well, it's interesting because LBJ was deep in radio. And there's that whole thing about his investments in Collins Radio. And I went into Collins Radio a little bit to see their background. It's a really weird story because there's an Antarctica twist there too. It turns out that this guy Collins was was in Iowa, and he set up his own radio set, and he was the only one in the whole world communicating with Admiral Byrd in Antarctica. And he starts Collins Radio. So there's a whole weird thing about him and LBJ, but there's a crisscross that comes up surrounding Antarctica, which is a large unanswered question, but gets us closer and closer. And it shows up in a flash in the assassination because of Byrd himself. But Berkner is another one very associated with this. Everyone around it seems to either have a UFO file or Antarctica connection. And what it tells me, again, is directly that it's directly related to aerospace. And it's interesting to me, too, because a lot of what Byrd did, he was taking grant money, and it was D.H. Byrd who was funding all these trips to Antarctica. And then the International Geophysical Year hits, Lloyd Berkner and all that stuff, and they all go back. Berkner goes back to Antarctica, Byrd goes back to Antarctica in 1957, and then he dies right after that. But for me, there's something really fascinating that the year starts off for D.H. Byrd, the owner of the Texas School Book Depository, and where does he go? He goes to Antarctica. So, it gets into weird territory once you start to just say, well, what are the odds? Yeah, I mean, he funded all these trips to Antarctica, but his first trip to Antarctica, he starts the year off, and then, he also takes off for a safari just before President Kennedy is killed. There's a lot of very unusual things there, I think, to be answered. De Mohrenschildt, I wanted to say this about de Mohrenschildt because I forgot about the Crozet part last night. So George de Mohrenschildt is the oil geologist. He's friends with Bush, and he has all these unusual connections, including Byrd, and he's associated directly with Byrd. Oh, they love my focus. There we go. What's weird about de Mohrenschildt is he becomes the linchpin in the case against Oswald. So, and for the Warren Commission, he'll do that. But then afterwards, he expresses remorse, and he starts to say, what a loving person. He loved Kennedy, and, I considered him like a son, all this stuff. So he doesn't, he's not on board with the whole Oswald thing after the fact. But then little by little, his situation deteriorates because he writes a book called I Am a Patsy about Oswald. And he sends it off to publishers, and all these weird things happen to him. His house is bugged, he's followed, and all the rest of it. And he writes, as I mentioned, this desperate letter to George H.W. Bush, as CIA director. And he says, can you stop this, gauntlet from closing in around me? I don't know what to do. I try to write a book about Oswald stupidly, and I guess all these people are after me now. Please help. So the House Assassination Committee kicks in, and they send him a subpoena, and then they find him dead in a similar way, that kind of phony suicide. And it's a particularly gory scene. But what's interesting is just before it, something plays out before the cameras. And there are all these news reports, and there's a Dutch reporter, Willem Oltmans, is over here. He plays actually de Mohrenschildt in the JFK movie. But Oltmans is very fascinating because he is saying, oh, de Mohrenschildt is going to say exactly who killed President Kennedy. He's going on the record, and all the weird things that Oltmans comes out with. It's like, it's almost surreal news reporting when you go back there and think, what did people think of this? But what happens is that de Mohrenschildt disappears and goes over to the Netherlands, and he meets up with Crozet, the clairvoyant. And he sits down, and instantly Crozet is like, oh my God, you're associated with the Kennedy assassination. And, de Mohrenschildt is like, how long do I have to live? And Crozet is like, the darkness, is encompassing around you. You've gotten in too deep with these people. And Crozet is seeing this other person who's responsible, basically. It's the whole system of people that de Mohrenschildt's been dealing with. And so de Mohrenschildt comes back into this kind of super ecstatic, bizarre, frantic state to the United States. And then he gets the subpoena, and he's found dead. Now, it's weird. There were weird openings there because de Mohrenschildt was probably one of the only people in the public who had the ability to identify who was involved here. But what's weird when we go into his history is he's involved not only with Bush, but he's involved with Jackie Kennedy's family very early on, so that he meets her when she's a 10-year-old girl. And then he's instructed by the CIA later to mind Oswald. So, you can't make up stranger connections than that. So that gets us into weird territory. My point about de Mohrenschildt, though, for this episode, is that he's a close associate with D.H. Bird, and he is part of this 8F group, which includes Connolly, LBJ, and Bird. So, that tells us that he's right in the heart of the action, and therefore his melting down about Oswald gives us the impression that he was actually incredibly disturbed that they had hoisted this and this whole thing on Oswald, the giving him the guilt. But it's also weird that you have this cultured oil millionaire who speaks several languages and all this hanging out with this, broke desperado, Oswald.
I love this picture.
Crozet is a weird, very strange story, and but he definitely he's an interesting psychic. Yes, what do you got?
Thomas Ball wanted to mention that McCloy set up CERN as a sovereign entity.
He did, yeah. And remember, CERN started off as a nuclear agency, and then they got into particle colliding. That's where the Large Hadron Collider thing came from. And so, yeah, part of that dimensional theater that goes on with CERN, the occult strangeness, has a very strong deep state background. Yes.
Master Poe. So what happened to Berkner after JFK was shot?
Wait, Master Poe?
Yeah.
Well, Grasshopper. Here's the thing. Berkner got involved with James McDonald, who was deep in the UFO file and also was bumped off by the X-Protect group by being so close. He'd been in there since 1950 on the UFO file. And James McDonald is hassling. Somehow he has a connection with Johnson and he's hassling him. And so Johnson goes to Berkner and says, you meet with him and my aide will record the whole thing, see what he has to say. And they meet in a house in Texas. They have a 3-hour meeting, and supposedly it disturbs Berkner. And long story short, very shortly after that, he's going, as I've told the story about Berkner, he goes and he's going to DC to give a speech at his think tank, and he stops to get fast food and he dies of a heart attack, basically while giving his speech. So the takeaway there is very strange, that they thought McDonald had a lot and Berkner maybe was siding with him. Berkner over and over again is a weird character because, yes, he throws in with national security. He throws in, with the deep state, but he seems like a crisscross between X-Share and X-Protect because he's not totally in, So there's weirdness there, but let's dial it in about Berkner again. He's the one who goes to Antarctica with Byrd and sets up all the radio there for Little America. He's the one who heads up the Robertson panel on UFOs. He's the one who starts the International Geophysical Year, where they discover dramatic things. And by the way, when they're doing the IGY, there's all kinds of Antarctica activity, and they do it with group scientists, and they take pictures of UFOs through Argentina and the South Pole and the whole Antarctica region. And that's where all of the early UFO pictures from that region come from. And they are dramatic. It's so, IGY and what happened there and how it changed things, because right after IGY, you have all the satellites. You have Sputnik. As a matter of fact, Berkner is the one who announces Sputnik. Oh, the Russians have beat us. They've launched this little ball in space. But then we put up some of the most sophisticated satellites very shortly thereafter. And so this whole thing is going into space. So that's how I see Berkner as kind of a crossover character. There's something about the International Geophysical Year that I think relates to UFO espionage, that we were trying to find out what the Russians had. And this brings me actually to a very weird segment in all this. Well, let's see if I can find it. But basically, there's a big connection with Byrd and Doolittle. So one of the pictures that I showed of Byrd with the lion, he's right there with General Doolittle. Now, Doolittle did in 1954 a full report for the president on the CIA, and it's still classified. But Doolittle had been involved in all these really, really big cases and fights and battles during World War II. He was a hero, and he was given all these medals by FDR. Later, I have him with Reagan and Goldwater, and they're giving him medals. So this guy was throughout the whole scene. But Doolittle is close to Byrd, and Doolittle has all these UFO signatures around him. One, when the ghost rockets phenomena happens in Finland, in Sweden, it's Doolittle who's on the scene examining all this. General Doolittle is doing all the ghost rocket sightings, and he catalogs 2,300 sightings of ghost rockets.
What are ghost rockets?
Well, the ghost rockets is a whole UFO phenomena that took place in 1946 in that Finland, Sweden area. And the danger they thought was that, somehow the Soviets got their hands on some of the Nazi technology and they're testing it out over Sweden. That's what they thought. But as it turned out, no, it wasn't that. So what was it? But the fact that they sent Doolittle in meant that he was the one with the expertise. That I find fascinating, because if you go a little further back into his history, it gets even weirder. He was a person who had spent time in Roswell setting off rockets, but that's 1936 and 1937. So before we have UFO crashes in Roswell and all the rest of it, we've got Doolittle working with Goddard setting off rockets in Roswell. So Roswell was already a target of this aerospace weirdness way before the crash in 1947. Think about that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. DRAM, the JFK assassination, aerospace, Antarctica, and the UFO file. They're all tied in together. One thing I didn't mention there when we were talking about Mac Wallace is that he worked for LTV. He was their employee, Mr. Fingerprint LBJ Hitman. He worked for LTV, and this is what's fascinating about him. If we go even a little bit deeper, there's no way with his murder conviction he could have gotten a security clearance to work at a government aerospace firm. So somebody up there liked him, and my guess is it was LBJ. Yes.
Ray Story, how did Doolittle wind up on safari with D.H. Byrd and with DRAM?
Yeah, that's a really good question. He's close friends with Byrd. And by the way, this is a shot of one of these cigar-shaped UFOs seen in the period of the ghost rockets. Now, it's interesting because if we are just to go back a little bit in time and think about the Casey readings, there's a Casey reading where he has a dream while he's giving the reading that he's reborn in 2100 AD in Nebraska, and Nebraska's on the coastline. This gets into weird territory, but what he says, and what's interesting about this, is that the scientists discover that he's the reincarnation of Casey in 2100 AD, and they decide, we're going to fly you to New York and check through your records and all the rest of it. And they're flying around, he says, and this is a dream from the 1930s, in cigar-shaped flying machines. And that most of the houses he notices as he looks out the window are made of glass. I guess that's what 2100 has waiting for us. But think about that in relation to Casey having this vision, and then all of these cigar-shaped UFOs show up. I mean, that's pretty interesting. So the Ghost Rockets piece with Doolittle gets us into strange territory. I'm going to do a quick thing here on Byrd that I wanted to insert, and we'll take your last few questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Special X Series 156, JFK Assassination, Aerospace, Antarctica, and the UFO File, going really deep. I want to remind everyone, especially if you're new, go to the darkjournalist.com website, sign up for our newsletter, and make sure you stand up and be counted. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch through all of this censorship we're dealing with. All right, here is a couple of memorials for Byrd. And there's never enough we can say about Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd. Inscribed on the base of the monument are Admiral Byrd's own words. Quote, "I'm hopeful that Antarctica, in its symbolic robe of white, will shine forth as a continent of peace as nations working together there in the cause of science set an example for international cooperation." I thought that was kind of interesting. Also, the most unusual Admiral Byrd monument. It's a pyramid. It's just screams mystical, no matter how you slice it. There's something indeed mystical about everything associated with Admiral Byrd and Antarctica. And let's not forget the Germans, paying for Byrd to come over there in 1938 and talk to them because they're like, we want to go to Antarctica. What do you got? Why don't you lead the expedition? Well, he turns them down, but he gives them a lot of pointers about it because we're not at war yet. But they loved him. That's Civil Air Patrol. D.H. Byrd gives you a little bit of a heads up there about who he is. The New York Times article I mentioned in his obituary, they don't mention that he owned the Texas School Book Depository. That's one heck of a thing to leave out. D.H. Harold Byrd is dead, a Texas philanthropist. There you go.
They're always philanthropists.
Amazing. Here's the bio. D. Harold Byrd, a philanthropist who made his fortune in Texas oil fields and helped finance the exploration of Antarctica, has died. He was 86 years old. Mr. Byrd, who was a co-founder in the Civil Air Patrol and a geologist, died Sunday at his home after a short illness. The philanthropist, here we go again, as a cousin and close friend of Admiral Richard E. Byrd, financed some of Antarctica's explorers' ventures in the 1920s and 30s. An Antarctic range, the Harold Byrd Mountains, was named for him. Mr. Byrd used his oil profits to build a financial empire that included recreational facilities, manufacturing, real estate, commercial and industrial ventures, farming and ranching enterprises. He and a small group of civilians funded the Civil Air Patrol in 1941 in Washington, D.C. He was also co-founder and director of Dallas area aircraft companies, including the Temco Aircraft Corporation. Quote, in 1957, he organized and became the board chairman of the Space Corporation. And if you go into the Space Corporation, there's not a lot of records left, but they built all the propulsion that became the Apollo program. They manufactured propulsion and ground test equipment for jet engines, aerospace ground support equipment. So the Space Corporation, 1957, Byrd, gives you some idea of what we're talking about. What they left out, he owned the Texas School Book Depository. What they left out, he had taken this Nazi assassin there and entertained him at his home for many months before taking off just before the assassination and going to Mozambique. That's pretty hardcore. Yes.
Devlin Leah McGregor, the Nazis plus the Greada Treaty is why JFK had to be removed, I think. Scarlet Fire's asking, are there any Nazi whistleblowers? And this is a Greek name, it's going to be hard to pronounce. Episkopos Egipetsko. What is the Nazification? What is the Nazification status of contemporary Antarctica?
Well, see, we don't know a lot about what's happening in Antarctica now. That's part of the problem. And, sometimes I talk about how in the hot zone, we actually can get our hands on things because it's the Caribbean. And there's a lot of, geopolitical aspects. There's a lot of drugs and other things. But you get a better shot of digging out some of these mysteries in the hot zone than you do in Antarctica, which really has become very difficult to get good data on. What we do know is that Lockheed Martin now has a major presence there. What we also know is over the past, say, 7 years, they've had some very unusual visitors. They had the Secretary of State, John Kerry, under Obama. He went there. We know Russian religious authorities went there. And of course, Buzz Aldrin, with this famous, evacuation. And supposedly somebody had hijacked his Twitter account for, he said, unspeakable evil. But he claims that he never wrote it. So we can't say for sure, but it's a little bit interesting.
What did he say about unspeakable evil? That's what he found in Antarctica?
Well, that was the tweet that he made while he
Okay.
was there. Yeah. And again, he doesn't take any credit for it. So yeah. But the fact, look, he's an Apollo astronaut. This guy was on the moon. So why is he in Antarctica, really? Especially at that age. They called him there as an expert on something. And it's interesting because I noticed when I was reading, there are little cosmic tangents in the D.H. Byrd biography that are unusual, but I'll give you the thrust of one of them here. One of them is that I was obsessed with this soil sample that I got from Antarctica from my cousin, Richard. He said, what obsessed me the most was that in West Texas, I found the very same specimen. So little weird things like that. And then tangents about, we're going to find out that there is no time. So D.H. Byrd is not some clownish oil billionaire or something. This is somebody who had studied through a trek of very deep aerospace information, mystical information. That's what gets revealed there. But I think the hunter in him and the boaster in him, displaying all the animals that he killed and things of this nature, when he put the window frame of the 6th floor depository there, this is one of his trophies. And it associates itself, none of us here believe that Kennedy was assassinated from that window. He was shot from the front, clearly. But it's his role. It's D.H. Byrd's role. That's the trophy in his banquet room, after all. Did I tell you he had a room full of dolls as well? Yeah. This is kind of interesting.
Sorry, Jimmy Lau Kennemer. Did D.H. Byrd have a connection to the Dallas Mafia?
Well, I mean, they say that everyone who was in big oil had that, hookup, because H.L. Hunt and Murchison all had the Hotel Del Charro, and, they had all the big mafia figures come in there. So, but I couldn't give you much more specific on that, except to say I think that the mafia aspect, when it comes to this level of aerospace, again, that they use them more as foot soldiers to do certain tasks, like, hey, Jack Ruby, go shoot Lee Harvey Oswald, that kind of thing. Yes.
Ogham 5, is it known whether there was any association between Dram and Otto Skorzeny?
Well, if he's doing these, part of the court case is seeking to see what the CIA knows about Dram, because what came out, some of the facts that came out through the OSS records were that, for example, Werner von Alvensleben had one son named Werner. So this is the Werner that we're talking about. The first one, again, was active around the Nazi Party, did something to tick off Hitler, was placed in prison for 4 months, but then Hitler took him out. It was like he was his best friend. Now, the son, who we're talking about, Dram, was responsible for the attempted assassination of Austrian Heimwehrführer, Dr. Richard Stadel, in 1933. So we have a 10-year period of him working as an assassin that kicks off with this failed attempt on Austrian Heimwehrführer. But he gets basically convicted for that. But Himmler uses him from 33. And then by 1943, he switches to OSS. So that the Hitler, the kind of Nazi aspect with him, they don't keep records of what they send their assassins out to do. It's just he got caught a few times. So we know where he was and what he was doing. And if he was working for Himmler as an assassin, think about that. You know, Himmler was the top man in the Nazi party. Yes.
KK Schertzer, didn't LBJ have a mistress who went public on his involvement? LBJ told her the night before the assassination, "Those bastards won't bother me anymore."
Yeah, that's Madeline Duncan Brown, and there's a few things there, which she actually had his child, as we know, and she knew all those people. She knew H.L. Hunt. She went to all the parties and everything, and she talked about that very mysterious party with Murchison and Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover the night before the assassination. And this is where we get into weird territory with the assassination, because think about the force of the assassination. In Dallas, on the day of the assassination, you have 5 presidents. Think about that. George H.W. Bush, he's a future president. John Kennedy. LBJ will become president right there. Nixon, who will become president, is there. He leaves on the morning of the assassination from Dallas.
From Love Field.
In fact, he does, yeah. And one thing about Love Field, which is Admiral Byrd, in 1938, the governor's like, "Hey, I'm going to give you all in charge of Texas aerospace. You know, you do whatever you want." And he says, "I want Love Field. I want it to be a totally worked out airport." And so Byrd, again, everywhere, you know, that's associated with the end there for Kennedy, Love Field, the Texas School Book Depository, he's right in the heart of it. But, you know, it is rather fascinating.
Who's the 5th president that was there?
Well, Ford, Nixon, Bush, Kennedy, and Johnson.
Okay.
That's 5. And Nixon, right? That's
Ford was there?
Yeah, he was there also. And it's interesting because for some reason, you know, it's just, there was something so momentous on that day. And it's so interesting when you think about it. Whenever people have done research on it, I remember reading Crossfire and Jim Marr's book. He's like, you know, Michael Meurtz, who was a French assassin, was in Dealey Plaza, you know, and then like there are all these people that are there. Who would be there in such a small stretch of land? Like they deported him, you know, like whatever he was up to, they didn't want anything to do with it. But how many different strange people can you fit? You know, the ex-Hungarian prime minister, he was in Dealey Plaza, you know, like, and it's true. It's not like, oh, everyone was there and it's a fantasy. No, they all were there. So it was like the greatest show on earth. Everyone knew something was going down. And that explains, you know, so much of the presence. But when you think about 5 presidents being in that geographical location, so the party that happens the night before is something that Madeline Brown spoke about. And she said that J. Edgar Hoover was there. And there's confirmation of this because people who worked for the Murchisons said, "Oh yeah, you know, there was a big party there at J. Edgar Hoover, and
he didn't tip."
Right, he was a bad tipper,
right? The chauffeur.
So you know, we get into interesting territory just thinking about why they were all there, what was being discussed,
what was being decided upon.
Yeah, LBJ, Nixon, you know, J. Edgar Hoover, Clint Murchison, like why are they all getting together there the night before the assassination? It opens you up to the idea, well, they all knew it was going on. They all had to be in some kind of agreement and some like, this is your role, this is your role. Although it is said that when the actual assassination took place that, you know, there's a lot of shock on the Nixon side that Ruby shows up because he remembers Ruby from when he was on these Senate committees. And he's like, wait, in 1949, this guy, Ruby, was spilling about the Chicago Mafia. He was like somebody who was giving us info about the drug trade in Chicago. So Nixon remembered him. So he knew, well, weird things were going on. Okay. Yes, you got it.
Rose Belitsia says that was a blood ritual. And Najat Madri says, could JFK's assassination also be some kind of ritual sacrifice to whatever god these people worship?
Well, I think they incorporated the whole thing. You know, there were a lot of things like when the killing of a president is on such a level, So when they arranged these other assassinations like Martin Luther King or President Kennedy's brother Robert, that's one type of thing that you need to set up. Killing a president requires all sorts of planning because you have the person who's going to take over. You have all the questions that are going to be asked. You're going to have people with motives. The presidency is such a high office in that regard. And Kennedy's in particular, his removal under such suspicious circumstances when he's really actively at war with his own Central Intelligence Agency, and how he defied the military industrial complex, his own military, over and over again in relation to advice about invading Cuba, going after the Soviets, and going into Vietnam and things of this nature. So he's coming from a totally different centered place. He knows how he wants to rebuild the world. And these people have been around in some cases, they've been around since World War One, but they've been around at least since World War II, and they've been shaping the world. And they're looking at him like, you can't get in the way of our plans. What is this? But the core piece, when we think about it, there's a number of flashpoints you could talk about, Cuba, Vietnam, and things like that. But it's really the aerospace track, because it's space that's going to be the control area for all of it. That's their goal. Remember, that's why you have Paperclip, the massive space program that associates with it. So that's where he's really run afoul of them on a deep level. And then you bring in the UFO file on that, and then him sharing it. You're in a no-win situation. They're not going to stand for that kind of competition. I have an article I wanted to read to cap off this episode, and it's about Dram, the Nazi assassin, being with Byrd, and Byrd introducing him to high society in Dallas. This is the Dallas Morning News, society editor for the news. Hollywood could not have picked the script. January 9th, 1964, about a month and a half after the assassination. They come back from their trip to Mozambique. Hollywood could not have picked the script. A German baron who attends safaris on a concession larger than the country of Belgium. His beautiful wife, a native African with the background of a famous old Portuguese family. But Baron and Baroness Alvenschleben of Lourenço Marquis, Mozambique, are for real and are in Dallas as guests of Colonel D. Harold Byrd. Colonel Byrd returned to Dallas 3 weeks ago from the hunt on the huge concession of 1,000 kilometers north of the seaport city of Lourenço Marquis. The concession, rented from Portuguese government, can be reached by bumpy roads and agony to travel, and so on and so forth. They go in there. And then they talk about his wife and how she married Baron Alvenschleben, former manager of a gold mine in Rhodesia 18 years ago, often accompanies him on safaris. And then she talks about some of the hunts and so on. The Baroness and Baron accompanied Colonel and Mrs. Byrd to the ball Mr. and Mrs. de Sanders gave Saturday night for his debutante daughters, Sue and Janet de Sanders. Above all, I am a woman, says the chic Baroness, and I enjoyed seeing the elegant decorations from the beautiful gowns from Dallas to Wichita Falls. We have been to so many parties, and I have gained several pounds and lost so much sleep. When the Baron and Baroness return to Mozambique at the end of January, she will rest and restore her energies. But see, this is the way that they were rolling out Alvenschleben. His wife was the belle of the ball. He was the Baron, the great safari hunter. And so this was kind of...
I think that's called rebranding.
It is. But you can also see that it's a great cover story, because instead of like, why is he there with this Nazi assassin? They have, oh, hey, it's this great safari hunter he brought over. One more quickie on this. Another article, same deal. Barron takes a look at Texas hunters. He was tall enough to have been a basketball player. He had a scar on the left side of his face that ran from his mouth to his ear, about which he volunteered nothing, but furnished a view of American hunters from the other side of the fence. He was Baron Werner von Alvenschleben, and although he used the broad A of English, and last was lost and grass was gross, that indicated Prussian descent, and a long wicked scar could have come from a saber in a schoolboy fight. Did that scar come from an African spear? He was asked by the columnist. No, he answered. He began talking about American hunters and the man who qualified for such. Just call me Werner, he said. Colonel Byrd introduced him as Baron. He had arranged Byrd's recent African safari as director of Safarilandia and arranged many more and had watched many an American hunter from a distant little or big corner, depending on how you look at it. And then they go into this whole thing about Mozambique and how, this guy is greeted there all through high society. Now, this is interesting because he mentions Elm Street, and they're making jokes here at the society ball with the press and stuff. And we know that the turn onto Elm Street is the assassination, but just play along with this for a minute. My narrowest escape, he replied, was at Elm and St. Paul in front of the athletic club. This town is much more dangerous than the bush. Animals don't do you any harm unless you or someone has wounded them. You can't say that for Dallas drivers. Ha ha. So you can see Byrd had that whole charm offensive for Alvensleben. And what we get really from the whole picture of this, I'm going to summarize it this way, and then we'll take your last question, is that Byrd, who purchased all these shares in Lingtenko Vout Aerospace, was working on experimental aerospace and had been active in rockets in 1936. So Byrd was active in rocketry. D.H. Byrd. D.H. Byrd has all these safaris with Jim Doolittle and Alvensleben. But Jim Doolittle also was active in all that rocketry in the 30s in Roswell. And so we have a number of people around Byrd, and it's almost like he can do no wrong because he's deep in that aerospace world. When it comes time for the assassination, he provides the perfect landing place for Lee Harvey Oswald, the Texas School Book Depository. They can do anything from there. They can fire diversionary shots, anything to blame Oswald. They can plant the rifle. There's a number of different things there they can do to control his movements. He's the perfect patsy, but they need a place that they can control. And Byrd's Texas School Book Depository provides the perfect landing pad for that. His cousin being in Antarctica, leading all the expeditions there, and then he himself going to Antarctica the year of the assassination, gives us a lot of connections along with Lloyd Berkner to Antarctica right off the bat that are just glaring. And even the fact that Dryhole Byrd has a whole mountain dedicated to him there. Then when you move in what we started with the LBJ piece and how LBJ actually had murders done on his behalf by Wallace, and then you have this connection of Wallace and his fingerprint in the Texas School Book Depository, and then you have Wallace working for LTV, which is Byrd's company, and hanging around there in Byrd's building. What we're getting is the entire operation, the CIA control of it needed the local piece, and it needed this crisscross of what people like Byrd were working on. And Byrd was working through the civilian air patrol, just like Jack Crichton and his civilian intelligence, 488th Intelligence Branch that had all the Dallas police in it. This is a way to create a kind of a buffer between the actual government. So they're setting up a kind of a different government sitting on top of things. And they can utilize that, as I said. That's what was utilized in the Kennedy assassination. And the presence of Dram in the middle of all of it, I think, gives us the hint of how the assassination was pulled off. That somehow he's there. There's no reason for him to be there, except that he has the assassination expertise and he represents that fascist element. And, on their side, Byrd and LBJ, they have a lot at stake for getting Kennedy out. And that association then between LBJ, the Central Intelligence Agency, and Byrd and aerospace is, on the face of it, just glaring at us when we look at the turn that the limo took onto Elm Street and into history right there. Because LBJ, instead of going to prison, he ends up ascending to the presidency. Our friend D.H. Byrd is happy, and he's, set up the patsy inside of his building, and he's worked with the Nazi doing God knows what to set up the train tracks for the assassination. But I think it's undeniable with the case that's coming forward that we're looking at something which is extraordinary, if information can come out about Dram's relationship to the Central Intelligence Agency, which drops off as soon as there are records for 1947. We never find out what he did in the intervening 16 years. That's the crucial piece, and we move into the next level of this as a follow-up on all of it. And now your last question, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so there's a couple statements and then the question. Don Neway says, quote, "Space War's coming and the U.S. is not ready. Tuesday, April 18th, 2023, Star Wars is not just a movie," said Steve Isakowitz, CEO of the Aerospace Corporation. Quote, "A 2001 report issued by then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld warned that an attack on space systems during a conflict, quote, should not be considered an improbable act." With that in mind, Robert Scott said, "Will they use UFOs to cover for their use of directed energy weapons such as were used in Maui?"
Yeah, that's all very interesting. You have tracks when you think about it. You've got advanced technology in space, things utilizing the moon. And you have a secret and unique space program, which is basically the COG version in space, say. So I think that this is part of the mentality around the Ukraine thing, because Russia's so advanced in space that you can't really do what you plan to do. As a matter of fact, they had something go up to the moon that crashed recently that looked like it was sabotaged, while India landed just perfectly. For me, they're far more advanced on the space side, as I've said from day one. So we know that. Once they stopped with the manned moon landings in 1972, there's no explanation for 51-year dropout of the manned program. And the last thing that they sent up that was manned was the Challenger, and the Challenger exploded out. That was the end of Kennedy's program, in fact, under Reagan in 1986. And then, we have these things where, Musk is sending up people and Bezos and all that. So they're corporatizing this space that they've worked out. They've worked out a lot of the kinks for it. They've privatized the area using public money. So I think the first real danger is control of everything on the ground from space, an unaccountable program. We started with continuity of government program. The emergency powers give you the ability to leverage all your assets. And from space, you can control everything on the ground. So this is the nature of the danger of falling outside of a democratic republic. You're surrendering over to corporations and unaccountable government. So that gets us into very tricky territory. But I think examining the roots of why there's always that UFO piece, why there's always that aerospace piece involved, as soon as we get ourselves into, the Lindbergh era of flight, things change dramatically. And, there seems to be something about the spirits of the air aspect and things that are discovered in relation to this that get us into almost a mystical stance when it comes to the space program. When it comes to Antarctica, it's no longer that you're dealing just with the physical aspects. Something else has opened up in relation to this. So, it's funny because when I was thinking of Byrd earlier, when I first heard about Byrd, I just heard, D.H. Byrd was like this jolly oil billionaire, and um, it's interesting because Bar McClellan, who I've had conversations with, and he was one of LBJ's lawyers, and he came out later and said that LBJ was associated with the assassination. In his book, Blood, Money, and Power, here's how he describes D.H. Byrd. Listen to this. He's talking about, different power groups in Dallas at the time. And he says D.H. Byrd attracted their interest around the military industrial complex. D.H. Byrd attracted their interest because he experimented in airplanes and rockets, important keys to the military industrial complex in the late 1950s. A member of Big Oil, D.H. Dryhold Byrd was best known for his lack of success in the oil business. Finally, when the East Texas field was developed, he bought into it and became wealthy. Through him, the foundations were laid for the military industrial complex that centered on LTV. With the money flowing everywhere, D.H. Byrd had enough extra to purchase the building that later housed the Texas School Book Depository. There were notable success stories. John Connally advanced into the governor's mansion. Clint Murchison and his Big Oil friends all had become new billionaires. And Dallas had become Big D. Old friends George and Herman Brown benefited with military construction during the war. And Brown and Root became the foundation for Halliburton. And LBJ basically helped build them up. But it's interesting, if you start with Byrd and you find out where was he doing this aerospace thing, you find him setting off rockets. This McClellan's pointing this out. And then if you really go into the history of it, it's happening when? It's happening in the 1930s. So by the time he assumes control of this aerospace company, he's already been at it with rockets since the 30s. So he's a real aerospace player. And as a matter of fact, LTV would go on for years, becoming a major NASA supplier. So, I think when you look at some of these people and the roles that they played in that assassination, their fortunes went incredibly well on the winning side, as it were. And with that, Miss Olivia, I think we're done for tonight.
Can I throw you one more?
Sure.
Okay. It's a doozy. Okay, so Thomas Ball said McCloy was higher than Dulles. Tim Houston says McCloy was the attorney for IG Farben too. Karen Carpenter asks, is the new frontier our bodies, nanotech shots, etc.? Brenda Fisher says, yes, your body is a battlefield now. Could you talk about the Nazis and
Oh, yeah.
IG Farben, etc.?
Well, McCloy is largely responsible for freeing most of the Nazis that were up on trial. So that was his key role. I told you that he met Hitler in 1936 and interviewed him. I think that's pretty interesting. And there is, there's so much about McCloy. His presence on the Warren Commission, I think he's representing the interest of that group, of that kind of paperclip piece. Just like Dulles is representing how all the intel agencies collaborated around this for the assassination. So, and how weird can it be when you have Alan Dulles, who Kennedy fired, running the Warren Commission? It shows that, in a way, the Warren Commission, part of the reason why we need to throw out this history is that thing sits there, as the government's answer to the assassination. And then later you have, like I said, 5 different, major investigations, and they come up with totally different conclusions, conspiracy and all the rest of it. But it's the Warren Commission thing that just sits there, and it's like, that's where the media get their talking points, et cetera. And for me, the fact that McCloy is one of the members of the Warren Commission gives us that insight that the Kennedy assassination was related directly through this sort of post-war fascist aspect, battling inside the government and not wanting Kennedy to share this high technology piece with the Russians. That's where the UFO piece comes up. That's why Caddy's hunts confession is so important. And it's interesting. There was something in here from David Talbot, The Devil's Chessboard, Alan Dulles, and the CIA. And it's a very good book. But he also mentions how D.H. Byrd didn't receive any attention for being the person who owned the Texas School Book Depository. So they had this kind of glaze over him. He left it out of his bio. It was left out of his obituary. This is just a little thing I'll throw in here that Talbot says. D.H. Byrd received scant attention after the Kennedy assassination, despite his building's role in the crime. The Warren Commission never questioned him. Reporters did not profile him, even after the millionaire took the odd step of removing the 8-pane window from which Oswald allegedly fired his shots at Kennedy's limousine and hanging it in his Dallas mansion. Byrd said he feared the souvenir hunters might steal Oswald's so-called sniper's perch from the book warehouse, but he displayed the infamous window in his home like a trophy. Do we get the picture now? We start to understand who we're dealing with. And let's remember in all of this that his cousin is not only Admiral Byrd, but his other cousin is Harry Byrd, the senator from Virginia. Harry Byrd is somebody who would snap his fingers and LBJ would jump. He was known as the purse strings for aerospace. So he was the purse strings for NASA, and Johnson was Senator NASA. So they're deeply interwoven in the aerospace aspect. And if you get even a little bit into some of the deeper stuff, like the Torbit document and some of the things that it released, you're starting to realize that the aerospace aspect and the protection of the UFO file through a group, they call it DISC, Defense Industrial Security Command, in the Torbit document, that group, von Braun headed up that group. That's where you have, this nest of paperclip people protecting their interest. That's where we get to the heart of the assassination. And you find right in the middle of it, Byrd with his LTV, Experimental Aerospace Company. I mean, that, and his visit to Antarctica earlier that year. I mean, it's astonishing when you get into it, but it lets you know the depth and the shockwaves of the assassination, the groups that were involved in setting the country on a totally different route and direction. And that's the direction that we've been in. And there've been, some kind of moves in the middle here and there, but really we're on the course that they set us up after the Deep State Revolt in 1963. Yes.
Are we all done?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Some super chatters to thank. Gillenjoy R. Marilyn, not Manson. A Cult Fan, BC, WC Ray, Doyle Wayne, Eurythmia's Fun, Slow Time, Brian Paget, Jonathan McIntosh, Sure Shot Save, Roosevelt Media News, TMG2RFJ, Erica Swenson Elliott, Robert Scott, Terry Doherty, Calvin F. Center, Amarillo Gunrunners, Jay Parsons, Helena Wilcox, Johnny Ricardo Bound, and Mur Bowman. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Fantastic. What great support from you. And for all our subscribers, thank you. It helps us to do the work that we do here for you. I did promise you the name of the Mason Lodge that Richard Byrd was a part of. And he was initiated at Federal Lodge number 1 in Washington, D.C. And he founded the first Antarctica Lodge, number 777, in 1935. And I mentioned the mystical aspect of 777. There's a weird Casey reading about 777 where he's going through the history and the life of Ouspensky, and then he starts going back and he says, oh, well, if we go back and further and look at his past lives, we found that he was the record keeper in the Mount. And he says the strange name. It sounds like Mahaba. And he said, in the Mount, he was the record keeper. 7th day, 7th hour, 7th year, 777, referring to Russian philosopher P.D. Ouspensky. So the 777 thing, if you look for it, it rolls deep. It goes through the Gurdjieff work, it goes through Tesla, and here we have it showing up as the number for the Antarctica Lodge. Absolutely fascinating. I'll do a couple of shout outs here before we go. And Doyle Wayne, it's great to see you. Jason May, wow, I like that. I know whenever we get into the Dram Bird thing, let me tell you, it's explosive. And I'm watching that case very closely. There we go. Najat, it's great to see you. Wow, again. It's that's what we're talking about. Has ties to Saturn. You have to tell me about that one. Timothy guessing we are on planet 7. Huh. Could be very well true. Sad no one will be held accountable. Yeah, I can understand that with a 60-year-old crime, but getting it straight and understanding what it is something that people have lived and died through, right? Remember some of these incredible researchers through the 70s and 80s, 90s, just going deep with the paperwork that they had and the insights. And here we are, really standing after them. And I've said this in relation to the UFO file too. It's quite fascinating that we're at this level with it. So many people have gone through, this not knowing thing in relation to it, but they have the stories or they lived through it. They were abducted or they saw the craft or their parents saw the craft, whatever it happens to be. If I go back more like my grandparents' era, they had to live through the Kennedy assassination and all the lies that came about as a result of it. And then, you start to get some idea of how things got to be the way that they are in this strange, disconnected fashion, where they're controlling elections, controlling the weather, running, COVID ops and running UFO threat ops and CIA control. I mean, it is, there's a departure in 1963 and it sets things on this rather perilous course. But hey, as long as we're hearing the ideas from, we can talk about it. What else we got? Pono, it's great to see you out there. Sundar Bliss, another great show. It's great to see you. And there's an Atlantis show coming up that you may enjoy. The dulcet tones of Daniel and Olivia are pleasing with the great information. It is Master Modwiz. He's out there. It's great to see you, sir. Fantastic show, as always. Thank you very much. Undestroyer, good stuff. I like that. Great show. I've seen the pics. Roosevelt Media News. DJ and Olivia, you knocked it out of the park tonight. There you go. Roosevelt, it's really great to see you out there, sir. It's great to be here with everyone. It's been a fantastic night. We had a lot to get through. And these shows, I mean, I'm telling you, this is the hardcore piece. Olivia Wings Girl, she's out there. Hey, how'd you do that? Helena Wilcox, stay safe, eyes open, be still and know. Hey, that's a nice one. Gigi Young is out there. Fantastic work. You have to go to ggyoung.com or Gigi Young on YouTube for fantastic stuff. Gigi's coming up on our show shortly. Incredible advanced work. If you want to go mystery school or deeper spirituality, that's where you're going, into Gigi Young's work. And DJ, Olivia, and the Ideas Room, thank you. Brenda Fisher, it's great to see you out there. Dawn Newway. Several liberal arts: grammar, logic, rhetoric, numbers, geometry, music, astronomy. Crucial arts, indeed. I think if you throw ESP in there, we're all set.
Mm-hmm.
I bet DJ sings Bowie in the shower. You bet correct. You just have to add the Police, the Pretenders, the Cars. Who else would you add? Tim Houston. Definitely occult designs around 1163 and 9/11.
Speaking of 9/11.
Yes. Friday Night Lights. Caritas Tarot. Yes.
You have a couple 9/11 shows. Do you want to spotlight those for people who may be new to the channel?
No question. There's a number of them. There's a band 9/11 episode that we did. And that's on Rumble, actually, with Jim Mars. It's quite remarkable. But there's a show that they left up, which is here on this YouTube channel with Dr. Farrell on that. Absolutely fascinating. And there's more to come out on this 22nd anniversary. And you don't have any answers around that. And just like Oswald was the designated culprit in the case of the deep event of the Kennedy assassination, the designated culprits, they had 19 of them in a 9/11. So we're never going to get the answers officially. We go through other channels, but COG took a big leap in 2001 with the advent of Homeland Security. That's the one to watch. Love the show, Angelina. It's great to have you here, Angelina. Thank you so much. Corky Goss, Scarlet Fire, Daniel List and his magic mirror. I see. Exactly. Wow. Okay. Fantastic, everyone. Doyle Wayne. I like it. LOL. End it with an LOL. That's the way to go. Nathan Allen. Thank you, sir. Appreciate your support and thank you for being here with us. We will see you all. Wayne Peak. Outrageous. Great to have everyone here and the ideas from fantastic questions. Miss Olivia, round of applause. Thank you. How amazing. And Scarlet Fire, thank you. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. We will see you all next week. And
if not sooner.
If not sooner, remember, never let it be for God. Once there was
a Camelot.
And watch out. Here comes Bobby now. He's finding alternative route. I'm 100% behind it. It says end broadcast, but it never really ends. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you soon.
God bless.